Right. إن الحمد لله وكفاه والصلاة والسلام على رسوله المصطفى وعلى عباده الذين ارتضى ومن بهداهم اهتدى وبآثار أهل المدينة اقتفى وبعد فسلام الله على القوم أهلا وسهلا ومرحبا. All right, people. First and foremost, let me just do a quick sound check just to make sure the audio's coming through. Let me bring up mi gente right here, people on Facebook and on YouTube. Just make sure. Right. So, let me just check. I take it you can all hear me absolutely loud and crystal clear, people. So, right, you're doing it. You're doing it. Somebody said the blur filter is annoying. Well, so can life be annoying. Let us try it. Actually, a lot of people are liking it. Let's see. All right, so tonight, people, let me bring before you first and foremost what you can see right here, the profile picture right there, people. All right, that is, you have Syed Hammad Ali, our esteemed guest tonight, hailing all the way from Canada. I'm gonna mispronounce the name of the city, so why not bring on the guest? أهلا وسهلا والسلام عليكم سيد حماد.
Wa alaikum assalam, Mufti Abu Layth. Can you hear my
I
voice?
can, loud and clear,
Great.
absolutely, crystal
Perfect.
clear.
So- Great.
Allah.
Thank you.
I was just about to
So,
mispronounce the name of the city. Where is it you're from?
yeah. So it's a city close to Calgary. It's a small city known as Lethbridge.
La Bridge.
So yeah. So that's where I am currently located at.
All right.
Yeah.
Doing it. Well,
It's a beautiful
well,
city.
firstly, shukran for taking the time out to be with us tonight to share your thoughts, precious research on MindTrap. It's an absolute honor to have you here. For our guests and viewers and those who follow MindTrap that are not so familiar with your work, a bit about yourself, Doc. I know you're a PhD. I did say doctor to be doctor, inshallah, very soon. باعتبار المعال soon, within a couple of months, I take it. So, inshallah, a bit about yourself in your own words, Doctor
Right.
Sayyid.
Right. So basically, I've been fortunate to study different disciplines, different subjects. And after completing my high school from Canada, I stayed with my family then in Pakistan. And that's where I was fortunate to study Islam with classically trained scholars. So then some of my teachers were students of great muhaddiseen like Abdul Rashid al-Nu'mani, Rahimullah, Abdul Fattah Abu Ghuda. Along with that, I was able to pursue an MPhil in human resource management. And then I came back to Canada, and then I was able to do an MSc in strategic management. And currently, I'm just completing my PhD in sociology. I'm hoping to complete it. I'm doing it from University of Calgary. I'm hoping to complete it by, inshallah, bismillah, by December. Unfortunately, the COVID situation delayed it a bit.
And your PhD, it's in sociology. What's your area of
Right.
research, your thesis?
So, to summarize it, I'm looking at how Muslim socioeconomic conditions are shaping their religious views and also their social attitudes. So, for example, what are the impact of different population proportion changes of Muslim populations on their views about others, about their religion? And the approach that I'm taking is a quantitative approach. That is, there's data that I have, secondary data, and based on that, I'm looking at how Muslim views are shaping. And
So
so,
the
sorry, go
more
ahead.
the more the cha-ching, the views
Yeah,
change with that as well.
it does. It sure does. And research does show that. And hopefully, we will be talking about how economic improvement leads to individuals holding more open, tolerant, liberal
All
views.
right, awesome. Just before jumping into that, a bit about because you have a background in Islamic studies as well. So, you've taken that very passionately in the past as well, dedicated an entire portion of your life to that. Just a bit about that experience.
Yeah.
First of all, you
So
studied in
yeah.
Pakistan, is that correct?
Yes, I did study, yes, in Pakistan, Karachi. Initially, when I
Ah,
had gone to,
I see a similarity. Is there
we sure do have similarity,
not just the goatee?
more than that.
Allah, Allah. So yeah, so you went to Karachi.
And initially, I got admitted into a medical college, but my desired aim was to study
Mm.
religion, and so I dropped out of that. I was in my third year of MBBS or second year, I can't recall, and then I actually went and studied in a
That's
madrasa.
that must
And
have
my
been a
yeah,
huge disappointment to your parents, though.
it was, I would, to be honest, my parents were, they helped
Oh
me. And I'll
wow.
be honest, even till now, yeah, my parents were, they said, if you don't want to do it, that's okay. But just don't forget that you need to learn.
Wow.
So actually, my parents were the ones who were saying that, you need to acquire knowledge.
Wow. Because I just thought that
So
every desi parent's dream is, mera beta bhi
yes,
doctor banega, doctor saab.
Yeah, yeah. But my parents, they were cool about it. They understood that I wanted to seek knowledge. I didn't want to per se like, be a typical Maulana. I was trying to seek knowledge.
Mm,
And when I went into the madrasa, a lot of times you're given this, this a perfect picture, this idea,
mm,
and yet that's not the
yeah.
case. And so after spending quite some time there, I decided that that wasn't the route I'm going to be taking. And so then I started studying with shuyukh. And that's how I got ijaza in hadith and fiqh, like Sahih Sitta, Kitab al-Asar.
Mm,
And so my primary teacher then he's the son of Sheikh Abdul Rashid al-Nomani, the famous muhaddis.
yes, of course.
So this way I studied fiqh, Hanafi fiqh, and then hadith, and so forth. And at the same time, I pursued my MPhil in human resource management.
Mm. You had you spent a brief time with Mufti Zarwali Saab as well.
I
Oh,
did.
right. Well, how was that? Share those experiences. How for those people
We
who don't ain't too familiar, Mufti Zarwali is on YouTube. He can be. It depends if you're in the right YouTube algorithm. Quite a phenomenon. He has his peculiarities.
What is interesting to observe is that um, I studied with him at that time when apparently coming on YouTube, having pictures, videos were forbidden.
Mm,
And is kind of, now that's the reason I'm doing this type of research, is that what are the factors that are making even the scholars in the community to hold different views. So here's a person, Mufti Zarwali, and he did not consider taking pictures or coming live as being permissible, and yet after 10 years or so, suddenly it's become permissible.
yeah.
So one has to then think, what are those environments, what are those socioeconomic factors that are influencing
Mm,
them? And it is not to criticize him, but the thing is that we need to recognize that individuals are a product of their own
yeah.
society. And they cannot then be taken as a reference guide for Muslims who are living in different socioeconomic
Yeah,
environments.
that's very well said, actually. Very well. And that's linked with, and I know we're going to come to that as well, linked with the proliferation of views, isn't it? It's kind of like a bottom up approach as well, isn't it?
Exactly. For example, when I was in madrasa, I found it very ironic that we would be told that certain things are forbidden, and yet when we would see those who are in a position of power doing something that was forbidden for to the students, then you do question the power relationships that are transpiring in such a setting.
You're like, Kari Sahab, ye kya ho raha hai yahan pe?
So it was quite interesting experience, and I have come to the conclusion that to acquire knowledge, if people assume madrasa is the way, I'm sorry to say this, but it's not the
Mm,
way. Because what happens is that the different interpretations that are present within the corpus, that Islamic tradition, they're not presented. And unfortunately, in the Pakistani madrasas, I feel that there needs to be more recognition of differences of opinion rather than saying I'm right and all others are heretic. That's problematic because when we recognize that whatever text we're reading, we
yeah,
are giving our subjective interpretation to that text.
absolutely. I mean, and just briefly before moving on from Mufti Zarwali is known for his temper. Sometimes, he gets angry, really worked up, and if he finds out somebody. In fact, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but there was some scholar called I don't know, Maulana Habib or something, or Doctor Habib from Karachi, who kind of opposed him on something, wrote a refutation, or said something about him. So he wrote a refutation. He got all worked up, and he wrote this refutation against him, and he titled it from Sahmul Musib fi Dubur al Habib, which translated as the kind of piercing arrow in the in the backside or the butt of Habib, this person Habib. But he's somebody who used to be known for his temper. Did you ever see any of that, or was that just how was it when you were there?
So since I did study with him and I completely do not accept his views. But having said that, I've studied with him. I'm not going to into the experiences that I had, but yes, unfortunately, they were quite. They were not the best of experiences at times. But having said that, what is more interesting is that if you notice that in the past, our scholars used to dispute with each other. So, for example, we know that Imam Muhammad al-Shaybani wrote a refutation against Imam Malik, but he still studied with Imam Malik.
Of course. Yeah.
We know that they used to write Kitab al-Rad, they would write Rad against each other, but they had that level of respect towards the other person. And I feel that is at times missing in our community. Just because we disagree with someone, we start using such, strong words towards the other person. I don't think that would be a way that we can progress then, because we have to recognize the differences even existed at the times of the companions.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So that is one thing I feel like that has to be taken into consideration. All the books that you see, Muhammad Ibn Hassan Shaybani, he's criticizing the Maliki school of thought, the Amal Madina, but you can clearly see he's not now, it's not becoming a personal vendetta or like a personal criticism of Imam Malik. In fact, he narrates from Imam Malik.
Of course. Yeah, no, absolutely. And so then you've come back to Canada, you've embarked on this PhD. Why sociology? Sociology of all things. I mean, people watching this are probably thinking, "What the hell is sociology?" No, I'm just that's a joke. Obviously, everybody watching this is enlightened.
Yeah. Interestingly, and this is the loss within the Muslim world, is that there has been so much focus on these hard sciences, that is those sciences that are focused so much on quantitative approach. What sociology does is that it makes you recognize how your societal experiences, your social reality is influencing you. And that is why, for example, I sometimes share this, you're not going to find an extremist who has a sociological background, because within sociology, they're training you to accept different diverse views. So sociology enables us to recognize what are the trends transpiring in the community. So, for example, because of that, we're then able to say that, okay, if this is happening, if these types of situations happen, then we can anticipate Muslim views, for example, becoming more moderate or more conservative. In this way, what sociology does is that it's looking at the whole society from a lens of understanding what are the general trends. And the thing is, it's trying to listen to the people rather than trying to enforce a idea on a people. It's listening to the discourses of the people and then recording that discourses so that it could transmit the knowledge that is accumulating through these discourses. So the reason then I took sociology was that
no, I was going to say yes. So I mean that you obviously this whole aspect which people have neglected, that all of these factors, but a PhD, that's quite a commitment to to this.
Because I felt and that a lot of times whenever we're having these Islamic discourses, whether it is it is a Muslim apologist, for example, or an anti-Muslim critic, we notice that they're always saying Islam is this or that, not recognizing that the text of Islam, whether it is the Quran or the Hadith, they're being understood through different lenses because they're being influenced by their own socio-economic realities. Let me give an example. Abu Hanifa was heavily influenced by his city, Kufa. And he would take the opinions of those Kufan scholars he knew, whereas Imam Malik took the views of the Madani scholars. Why? Because he had understanding of that. So we have to recognize that. And so what happens if we recognize this, then we can also know that there are multiple interpretations of Islam. Rather than, trying to criticize Islam or the Prophet, we have to recognize that the criticisms can lay at the level of interpretations of Islam. Because you'll find plethora of interpretations ranging from the most extreme to the most conservative, and you will find all of them claiming that this is Islam.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And honing in your research, focusing, kind of zeroing in on what you really focused on, and that was the salvific aspect, the salvation, to do with who wins in the afterlife.
Right.
Are we just wasting our time, or is there success to come? So डॉक्टर साहब कुछ बताएं हमें यार, ये वक्त ज़ाया हो रहा है, क्या हो रहा है यहाँ पे? Who's wrong? Just let us know who's definitely going to hell and who's going to heaven.
So that's the interesting thing. So salvific concept or issue or topic is part of my research. Of course, I'm looking at other issues as well, Muslim social issues. So I've been looking at their religious views and also at the societal view, their social attitudes. But talking about salvific, it is interesting to note immediately. And sometimes we hear that people say that why is it that non-Muslims would suffer eternal damnation? Right? They would argue that. And then we would find Muslims saying, oh, no, there is salvation, hope. The problem is that we don't recognize both are coming from their own social economic backgrounds as well and conditions. First of all, we need to recognize that there has always been a difference of interpretation on this issue. Yes, the dominant interpretation in the pre-modern world was that only Muslims would attain salvation. But there was always that leeway, that hope, because of the issue of God's mercy encompassing everything and God's mercy overriding his wrath. That may be the case, but there are also other factors that come into play. So the Muslim world, on an average, maybe 20% of them believe in this question about whether non-Muslims can attain salvation. So in my research, I was looking at this question that does Islam only lead to salvation, or do other religions can also lead to salvation for their followers? Okay, so that was the question. Does Islam lead to salvation in the hereafter, or can other religions lead to salvation? Now, when this question was asked in the Muslim world, majority of them said only Islam. Yet when this question was asked to American Muslims, this was a 2011 survey, majority of them believed that other religions can also lead to salvation. Now that we have recognized...
Majority of American, Muslims? Muslims, okay.
Yes. American Muslims, US Muslims believe that other religions can lead to people to attain salvation as well. Now that's interesting. Then the question comes, you have people in the Muslim world who are opposing this. You have this in the American Muslims who are agreeing to this. That is, salvation can be found outside of Islam. Now, immediately this question, when you look at this data, this is just at a descriptive level. Then the question comes, what's Islam's position on this? And we have to recognize that at times this notion that we take Islam to be shaping Muslims is problematic, because the reality is that our socioeconomic environment influences how we look at the world, and based on that we then have communications. You and I, for example, are having this communication in this claim space. We are creating this type of discourse whereby others are listening, and that influences their thinking. And this type of thinking and discourses in turn lead us to look at the text and reevaluate. So then what I did, and this is a quantitative approach I took, I looked, so basically using the data, I ran a logistic regression. Logistic regression means that I'm doing a predictive modeling.
Oh, rather complicated stuff here.
Sorry for using the
heavy bring on all the terminology. We love the terminology. What did you say it's called? Logistic?
Logistic regression using data. So these are like data analysis program. Now, this is the thing that often when we talk about these issues, we're trying to find Quranic interpretations. Like someone would say Surah 2, verse 62, that, it says all those who believe, the Jews, the Christians, the Sabians, all those who believe in God, no fear upon them. I'm paraphrasing this. But the thing is that you'll see other scholars saying, no, 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 this has been abrogated. This is not anymore acceptable. But then you would have people arguing, saying that, oh no, this when it comes to divine promises, God's laws and God's promises are not abrogated. It's only at the ahkam level, at the legal issues. This has been taken. There has been countless discourse on this. Yet, as far as I'm aware, research taking this quantitative approach is still missing. So then I thought, based on the sociological theories, one theory says, and this is known as the intergroup contact theory. The intergroup contact theory says that once you have friendship with people outside of your own community, your views about them are going to become more tolerant, positive.
Intergroup contact theory.
Yes.
You need to integrate the groups, people integrate.
Yeah, right. Next was that I wanted to look whether converts would be more likely to accept this notion that salvation can be found in other religions because their parents, relatives are non-Muslims as compared to born Muslims. And at the same time, I wanted to look at whether economic situation has an impact. I'm just gonna, summarize basically what I
tell us.
Whilst
we look how we lie back, relax, and listen to the salvation and the damnation of humanity.
So the question was interesting was those who have more non-Muslim close friends. So those who have a large proportion of non-Muslim close friends in their friendship network, compared to those who have only Muslim as their close friends, or most of them as close friends. So I repeat, those whose non-Muslim friends they are more in their close friendship network. They are more likely to believe that other religions can lead to salvation compared to those who said that most of their friends or all of their friends are Muslims. Why did that happen? Because when you have these positive experiences with people of other communities, once you experience this positive experience, it shatters your preconceived notions about others. Yeah. And so then when you're like, oh, this person has been so nice to me, he has always been there for me, God is merciful, what would happen to them? So what happens? They go back to their text and they find interpretation that would suit that. Yeah. And this is what happened in terms of those who have more non-Muslim as their close friends than those Muslims who report they only had most or all their Muslim friends.
This study sample, these were what? Americans, Canadians, Westerners, what were they?
American Muslims, 789. And this was the limitation that I had. And of course, you need to do further research, other samples, but it does connect with the theory, right? Second, I found that converts, again, more likely to believe than born Muslims. Why? Again, it does make sense because and this is interesting because I read an article by Dr. Jonathan Brown where he talks about this issue. And the first thing he started was he said that my son asked about what would happen to grandfather. Because his grandfather, he wasn't a non-Muslim. May he rest in peace. So what happened was that he said he's in heaven. So my point, what I'm trying to say, without saying he's right or wrong, that's not my intention. But my intention is to show how our different environment does influence us.
I want to ask. I feel sometimes that many converts that come to the religion, they usually have, I don't know, maybe it's just my experience, but they tend to have a tendency to be quite awkward about the religion. Maybe it's just something about the ritualistic nature that draws in people that are almost autistic or something. But I find them sometimes much more harsh than regular Muslims. So I'm surprised when you said converts being more open. I mean, I'm happy to hear that, but I'm quite surprised because my reaction has usually been with converts sometimes being over identifying and trying to stamp out their new identity so much that they tell me things like, I don't visit my family on Christmas, I don't do this, and I've said to them, why? You should, but they tell me no, this is my new deen. And so what did you find when you spoke to converts?
So this was one other part of my research was doing actually interviews with Muslims in Alberta. And the thing is that we have to recognize perhaps one other case might be is that converts, like for example, we have to differentiate between those who are highly educated and those who are coming from a low income background. That would have an effect. So for example, I spoke to a Muslim woman who was a convert, and she did her master's from a top university in Islamic studies. And it was interesting to see that her views were views that perhaps the dominant the dominant interpretation of that normative understanding, it rejects that. We have to also recognize that when we're talking to converts, initially they do show that strictness, but with time
Mm,
they do
of
adapt.
course, yeah.
And if they don't, that is why we do have, and this is another issue that perhaps Muslims need to be aware of, that whenever we have Muslim converts, many of them leave as well because they don't get the support. They get this strict
Yeah.
interpretation of religion, and that's problematic. One another thing, at least in North America, we need to recognize is that the emergence of fiqh al-aqaliyat, that is this fiqh for minorities, there are two forms of it, wasati and the salafiya.
Mm,
The wasati was people like Taha Jabra Alwani. They were residing in
mm.
America. So a lot of forms of these, you can say, more open to engage different
And
views. This
just
type of
for
fiqh has left.
people viewing that ain't too familiar with that, fiqh al-aqaliyat is something, a notion that a focal point, or a focus point that had been more amplified in recent, maybe just the last 2 decades, really, which was about the fiqh or the rulings for minority Muslims, or Muslims living as minorities throughout the world. That's the fiqh al-aqaliyat. Now,
Right. And that was specifically focused for the Western Muslims. And the thing is that with that, we see that this form of the Wasatiyah form became more prominent in North America compared to perhaps we would argue in Europe.
mm,
You see that, for example, in UK there is a still more acceptance or more connection with Deobandism, Barelviism, and such.
mm,
That may not be the case for Canadian
yeah.
Muslims. So that is another factor that has to be taken into consideration. And secondly,
Why do you think that is?
one of the reasons that there is this difference is that those who came to
Mm,
Europe after World War II from the Muslim world, most of them initially came and there was this intention they wouldn't come back and they were just coming as for the labor market. And they were usually coming from the low income group within their own countries and from rural places. So they migrated. And this is where actually the Europeans did also. Now, there's this issue of integration and immigration. The thing is, there was assumption that they would go back, but then recognizing the facilities provided by European societies and the freedom and all that, many of them decided to stay. Whereas this was not the case for for Muslims going to North America. Already, many of them were highly educated and were coming from middle and high income
mm,
groups. And so clearly, the starting phase of Muslims in North America compared to Muslims in Europe
yeah.
differs, and that can clearly be seen now, the outcome of that is the what is happening in terms of the differences. You would find the North American Muslims holding more open views as compared to Muslims in Europe. Again, it's not good to generalize, but these are types of certain
Mm.
forms that are appearing.
No,
You will find
absolutely.
differences.
I've
Yeah.
spoken about this on some previous shows as well, that the Muslims within the UK, predominantly hailing from what is a rural village lifestyle back home. And even if some of them were, for example, they had wealth back there, even if they did, but it's not so much about the wealth, because the moment they come here, they've come into a working class setting. So they've come into things like factory work. So even if you did own all these lands back at home and you did these things, but it was still a village mentality, and you've come from that into a working class kind of. So even if later on you did do things like I think the Pakistani, let's say, Muslims within the UK, they have, I think, a considerable amount of, for example, wealth. They're not like, generally, I don't get the impression that, I mean, maybe some are, but generally they're okay, or and some are very well off. But it hasn't really changed that rural mentality. You see, like, so there's an interesting distinction. It's not like wealth doesn't necessarily change it. Like you come from a village, this kind of chodrahat, chaudhries, and they do this, and the caste system, and people are still fighting over petty things, and he's kind of built a wall on my land, and we're gonna, this kind of mentality, which is totally different to a city. You've got a doctor, an engineer, a lawyer, totally very different, and
Right.
yeah.
I would also perhaps, and more data needs to be looked at it. But when I was doing my preliminary research, I noticed that American Muslim, most of them do report that they do have non-Muslim as their close friends.
Mm,
This is not the case in such a high percentage, or in such a way that in America, if we compare it with
yeah,
UK
because
Muslims.
yeah,
So
because there's a
again,
lot
oh,
of
sorry, go ahead.
I mean, I don't know if the word ghetto is the right word, but there's a lot of concentration of Muslim communities here. So when Muslims came here, they lived, obviously there was security in numbers. So they came here
Mhm.
as laborers, and so they weren't like educated. So it's safer to stick together. And then they just proliferated in these areas. So you've just got so entire areas now, and which are just like not entire, but almost entirely or heavily Muslim. And so they don't, I mean, they might mix at a uni level. They go out and they mix, but you're right. I don't think they're anywhere
And
near the Americans.
and that is why it is so important that Muslims have interactions with non-Muslims, whereby they can sit together, they can have these discussions. Unfortunately, now what is happening is that there is a lot of misunderstanding transpiring between both Muslims and non-Muslims. For example, within Europe, yes, you're seeing this movement whereby new contemporary opinions are
Mm.
emerging. But the thing is that they're not being, people are not aware, because a lot of times when someone who acknowledges pluralistic interpretations, sometimes the community might say, oh no, we can't accept such an interpretation. There is that mistrust, unfortunately. Whenever there's going to be a mistrust between two groups, it leads to more strict interpretations, both in terms of one's social attitudes and also towards in terms of religious viewpoints.
Absolutely. I mean, here in the UK, their usual interaction with the non-Muslims is when they're selling them drugs. I'm joking. I'm joking. But yeah, so I see. No, that's very fascinating, though. That the American majority of the American Muslims, and I take it, I assume like Canada would be very similar to that anyway. Uh, that they have this very accommodating view for
Yeah.
non-Muslims. Wow.
Yeah, yeah, and that is why you can see, for example, now you have Muslims who are in they're into politics. They're part of groups. They're entering into positions whereby not just at the engineering level or medical level. That's usually the case, right? That most of them, many Muslims initially they were working in these types of sectors and field, but they are now going different fields as well. So they're going to politics, and this is a good sign in terms of showing integration. But at the same time, what is happening, and this is one thing that people were initially concerned, or what if Muslims go into politics, they would try to implement, some form of Islamic law? No, that's not the case. What is interesting is that, in fact, secular interpretations, liberal interpretations, are being used to give different views about Muslim terminologies. Let me give you an example. So, when the Muslims migrated here, they came, they didn't ask scholars, but now the scholars had to justify. So they gave the notion, we are going to give da'wah. Now, generally, when we speak of da'wah, what does it
Mm.
mean? We need to convert people,
Yeah.
right? No, but now what is happening is that some of these scholars are actually connecting da'wah as a form of civic solidarity. They're connecting it as a form of, engaging positively, sharing with each other their different perspectives. There shouldn't be any forceful conversion, and literally they're using these words like known as atifa, which means attachment. So what is happening? The notion of civic solidarity is making this notion of civic solidarity is being used to explain dawah, the concept
Where
of
is this
dawah.
in Canada?
In North America, these types of
Okay.
interpretations. So, Dr. Andrew March, he has written an article on this source of moral obligation, whereby he explains how did scholars give permission for Muslims to live in non-Muslim world. But before that, what is also interesting to note, a lot of times we think, oh, does Islam allow us to live or not in a non-Muslim country? The reality is that millions of people migrated to the West. Once they settled down, then the scholars recognized in the Arab world, Muslim world, subcontinent world, that okay, we need to give some justification. The reality is the ordinary Muslim was not interested in what the scholar would say. So this form of interpretation is a retroactive rationalization of the reality. So the people became the Mustafti, asking questions, and they in turn influenced the scholars. That is an important point to recognize.
A bottom-up approach.
Yes. Well, if we consider the scholars as
the
a top approach,
yeah.
I would consider them as, at the horizontal level, left and right.
Yeah, but I mean, absolutely. So it's basically it's by public demand. That's what we're saying in essence.
Yes, and what happened with that? And there's another recognition that scholars they themselves have discussed is that okay, if you don't give this view, an ordinary Muslim, by ordinary I mean someone who's not trained in fiqh and all that, they would just take another viewpoint. So now there's actually a religious market.
Yeah.
The people have become the clients, and they're people, different scholars, as selling they're selling their own product. So we have the religious market.
Janta ki demand. Janta ki demand.
Yes.
This is it's true in a way, and this is you see, I get criticized for this. That look, Mufti Abu Layth, what he does is he makes things easy for people. He gives fatwas. Everything's halal. Everything. So people go to that. So the assumption is that, and I'm not saying people don't do this, but this is their point, that people are shopping. And they're coming to, they're seeing something easy and they want something easy. This guy's giving them something easy, so they're taking it.
Right. And again, so this is important to recognize these dynamics exist, and these are types of ways Islam is being shaped. Then the question comes, and so as my research shows, and we know that this issue of salvation was such a main component, yet we see such difference of opinion. Then it's difficult to argue what is the right interpretation of Islam. We cannot then say that it is Islam that is shaping Muslim as strongly as then we can say it is Muslims in their changing socioeconomic environment influencing the interpretations of Islam.
I mean, can one make a claim that there is just one interpretation of Islam?
It is. So the problem with that is that we need to recognize whenever we're reading a text, we are subjectively interpreting it. That is why scholars differentiated between Sharia and fiqh. They would argue fiqh is that human endeavor to understand the divine mind, but the Sharia is something that only God knows. For example, Dr. Khalid Abul Fazl, in his book Great Theft of Islam, I think that's the name he argued for. Clearly, we see that also being argued by Dr. Rumi Ahmad as well, because the reality is that fiqh it's a form of human endeavor. It's a form of human struggle to understand what the text is saying, and we can discuss about issues about so many these problems that we are facing, and we'll find that two groups are taking the same verse and giving different interpretations.
Cool.
This is what has happened between the Wasatiyya and the Salafiyya groups. That is within the Fiqh al-Aqaliyat. We have narrations that would say that the Prophet has nothing to do with a person who lives in a non-Muslim land, something like that. But then the scholars would argue, they would say, oh, it was for that context. It was just for that time. It was not at this particular time. That it was different. I'll give you another. If I may just add another example. The notion of Darul Islam and Darul Harb. Well, here's the reality. That was the general perception. But now scholars living here finding that in the Western societies, Muslims by and large have more rights than if they live in Muslim world, generally speaking. So, for example, it's a reality that my parents migrated. I can get a citizenship here. My son is born. He gets a citizenship here. There are some Arab countries you can never get citizenship even if you live for 40 years, right? So that form of certainty of being a citizen of a country That is a positive sign. So now what happens? This positive experience made some scholars within the fiqh al-aqliyat say, oh, you know what, Darul Harb? No, 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 it's not that anymore. This is now known as Darul Dawa or Darul Ahad. That there's a treaty or there's a peace. It's a land
Yeah.
of Dawa. It's a land of spreading Islam.
Yeah.
So you can see how clearly their environment has influenced them.
See, here's the thing. You see, to me, just preparing for the kufr I'm about to say. No, so to me, the Sharia is what I've referred to in the past as it's a kind of kintsugi effect. It's like the art in, the Japanese art of mending broken bowls decoratively so as to make them look even more appealing than they were. And you see, the Sharia were remedies, social remedies for the social problems from that society. It wasn't like, so for example, here is Arabia and they've got some problems going on, let's say, like everybody does, and it could be buying, selling, fighting, killing, stealing, anything. So what we're going to do is, well, how do the Chinese do it? Let's import an entire system and put it here. And prior to that, nobody's heard of these things. Rather that these people, these rules by and large existed amongst them. So the Sharia is kind of, it's just reshaping some of the rules where they're excessive. It's kind of curbing them in and giving them back with some limitations. So, for example, when a person stole, sometimes they cut his hand, sometimes they might have cut his arm, sometimes they killed him. Now the Quran, so at the time it restricted it to just to the hand, which was already a custom. It's not that the Arabs had never heard of cutting the hand; they used to practice these things. So what I find is it's strange that, you see, and I know this is probably very controversial as I say this, not so much what I'm even that is, but this part, I feel in some ways the scholars have taken the Sharia as a demigod. That Allah can only be like, Allah without this Sharia is nothing. Like, it doesn't, like, to them, this, like, people say that how can there be an Islam if there ain't rules of how to, you see, to them, God can only mean something if he's telling them off. I just find this, I don't know, what are your thoughts on this? I know this is a bit weird, but since you study people.
So, since you mentioned and you used the word demigod, what I would say is that, and I would relate it to the book that we were previously discussing, Shahab Ahmed's What is Islam? I think it's a brilliant book. And if anyone gets the time, they should read about it. Some scholars, more from the traditionalist camp, they would say Sharia is like water. You put a water in a certain cup, it's going to take its shape. You put it in another cup, it's going to take another shape. So that's how they see it. But then if we take this analogy, then we have to recognize it's the shape of the cup that is influencing what is Sharia to be perceived. We don't know what Sharia is at that level. When we talk about the notion, when you say demigod, instead of that, we can then consider, this is what a lot of people assume, Sharia is absolute. It might be absolute at the theoretical level, but when it comes to its application at the worldly level, it has always been subjective. Mm-hmm. It has been, it will be. We can clearly see the difference between the Ahlul Rai and the Ahlul Hadith, or the Kufans versus the people of Medina, right? Now, having said that, this is important to recognize that a lot of us, and this in the past, in the pre-modern world, yes, there were these strict patriarchal rulings, but there was also another form of Islamic interpretation, which was heavily influenced by Sufism and philosophy, even if the average person didn't know, but they had that. And that's why you see Mirza Ghalib's poetry being influenced by Ibn Arabi's viewpoint.
Do you feel Mirza Ghalib was influenced by?
I absolutely think so, because when he says that poet where he recites this couplet, he's saying kuch na hota to phir main kya hota, something along that. Dubaya mujhko mere hone ne na hota main to kya hota. because he's talking about, if anyone has read Ibn Arabi's views, the notion of, in the divine mind, all of us were, and then we were given existence, which we can discuss later. But these are things that we can notice. The pictures that the Muslims made, Layla Majnu had also an esoteric interpretation. It was the notion of that divine love. So what has happened is that, unfortunately, with the modernization that has transpired, and also certain regions having that influence, you have a very fiqh oriented Islam that has emerged in the present time, that negates this more inclusive acceptance form. So now what has happened is that when you said, oh yeah, people want the Sharia, what has happened is that in their mind, God is absolute and he's giving us laws like a king. Yes, that is part of, this is the Islamic tradition. Now I'm not saying this is my view or that.
Yeah,
I'm
of
just simply
course, of course.
explaining that this was one view. But the recognition was that in the past, beside the notion of tanzih, that there is Allah and there is the creation, there was also the notion of tasbih between, and this was the idea that wheresoever you turn, there is the face of God, or he's awwal wa akhir wa zahir wa batin, and so forth. So what has happened is that in today's world, it's a very hierarchical approach we are taking. We believe this is what the Quran says and we will apply that, not recognizing this other form of interpretation that have always existed.
Yeah.
So when you said that, from that perspective, it makes sense that we're just focusing on text. The pre-modern world wasn't just focused on text. There were three levels: pretext, and this I'm quoting Shahab Ahmad's approach. There was the pretext, there was the text, and there was the context, and this related to the revelation that was given to the Prophet of Islam. May I
Yeah,
explain what
of
the
course, of
pretext was?
course. Go for it. What's the
The,
pretext?
the concept of pretext was, there is that divine ultimate reality that has sent the text. Now, how can one reach the divine reality? That can be done through philosophy, or that can be done through illumination of the heart. And then you had those who would say you need to take a literal interpretation. And then there was this understanding of the text related to it. And then these effects transpired at the context level, at the societal level. So you found that the pictures that people would make of Layla, Majnu, or the pictures whereby people are sitting drinking wine, these are pictures of the past. They were considered as Muslim Islamic pictures because they were, in their views, representing something more divine. So it was related to the pretext, understanding of the divine love between the creation and the creator. So this amalgamation, as you can see, had so much different, various flavors within this interpretation of Islam that unfortunately has been restricted.
Yeah. I see. No, absolutely. And the reason I was saying in this particular way, it's more. I'm not. You see, it's not that people say the Sharia is God in the sense, okay, but it's in practice, people, not all people, but there seems to be many people who, to them, if God is only understood through these words of halal haram. If there is no halal haram, there might as well not be a God, because to them, what's the point of Islam then? And I find that so shocking that people say to me that, yeah, but what's the point then? And you think, I just find it like so wow that the only point for you is that there are simply don't do this, please do this, or you must do this. That is it. It very reminds me of a certain like kind of rabbinic tradition, within Judaism, and how whether it was the Levites or certain people who had this very everything is about this law, and they reify the kind of reification and then the deification almost of this law. That's why I kind of feel that sometimes that Sagar Siddiqui, when he says that kitni haqiqatein hain oham ke sahare, and in a way that people, they do their bandagi but asnam ke sahare, that they will worship but they need, like an idol, they need something to worship through. And to some of these people, it's the laws. I mean, as bizarre as this sounds, people are probably thinking Mufti's lost the plot now.
I there might, it does make sense, because if we notice what happened once the Muslim world got its independence, when they were once colonized and they got independence, you had political Islamic movements emerging. And they were always arguing about implementing God's law. So this influenced the Muslims to assume that okay, Islam is simply a set of laws whereby we have to establish in order to make Muslim land and Darul Islam. Otherwise, it will remain as Darul Harb. So this was significantly influenced also by the political ideologies that were transpiring at that time. And that is what.
No,
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to actually just share an example of
Yeah.
something I'd right, okay, of a hadith that I'd actually, well, I've been looking into this topic. It's part of the research I was just discussing today as well, so I'm just bringing it up here. It's a very fascinating hadith, initially brought to my attention through Dr. Yasmin Amin. But also, then since I've been looking into it, it's a hadith that is from the Sunni tradition. It's from Abu Dawood. It's in the Musnad of Ahmad. It's in Al Hakim. It's in Bayhaqi's Sunan. It's Tabrani in his Awsat and in his Kabir. And Abu Dawood has another riwayah as well. Okay, so the hadith, people, it's from Zayd ibn Arqam that قال جاء رجل من اليمن إلى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. And so this person comes, he says, Inna thalathata nafarin atau aliyan. So three people, he's telling the Prophet that these three people came to Ali, يختصمون إليه في ولد قد وقعوا على امرأة في طهر واحد. So all of these, because you see, towards the later part of the Prophet's life, Ali is he's sent to Yemen on several occasions. The Prophet sends him, he collects taxes, sees some of their affairs, sees to their affairs, comes back. So he has this relationship with them, and hence a lot of the Yemenis were very pro Ali as well after in the time that came after. But so in this incident, these three men have Muslims. They've all had sex with this same woman in one within a short span of time, and within one menstrual cycle, that same purity period. So, and it mentions that she's had this child. So they're all claiming that it's their child. Now, just coming back to this text, they come to Ali. فقال الاثنين منهم طيبا بالولد لهذا. So there's a few things in this narrative that I just want to point out. One is that these men are all admitting to having sex with this woman. Yeah. Two, that they don't know who the child belongs to. And they're all kind of making a claim to the child. Three, they come to Ali radiallahu anh to resolve this matter. Now, the way he resolves it is he says to them, he goes about and he says, well, okay, I'm going to make two of you take a particular... He says that you three are basically in dispute. It's like you've all got partnership and you're disputing something. And then in the end, the interesting thing is, he kind of resolves it by saying, he having a discussion with them, but then he says, فَأَقْرَعَ بَيْنَهُمْ. He drew lots. Okay, a lottery, basically. فَجَعَلَهُ لِمَنْ أَصَابَتْهُ الْقُرْعَةِ. So in the end, eventually the one who won from this draw, they gave the child the lineage to that person, and the others, he had to pay them some compensation as though, and so there's some compensation involved as well about the diya. But when the person tells the Prophet this, says فضحك رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم حتى بدت أضراسه أو نواجذه. Now this, and then Abu Dawood and Nasa'i all mention this hadith, Al-Hakim, Bayhaqi, all these people, the Sunni traditions. Now, what's interesting is in this hadith there is no mention of there's no mention of had, of punishing those people. When it comes to who should we give the child to, it ultimately comes down to a lottery, which, by the way, on its own, people consider haram almost. You know, like drawing lots almost, especially to gain something. And it's interesting that you have this, and then you have certain scholars like Ibn al-Qayyim has a whole section, which we were also discussing today, where he says that, look, that qur'a, and I'll go over this in my Monday Nights with Mufti anyway for the viewers in more depth, but him explaining that qur'a, that drawing lots, lottery, is also an accepted method in certain times, and he also quotes this incident amongst other incidents in when it has been used in Islam by the Prophet and or being condoned by the Prophet. Now, what's interesting is here is a method, here is something, a hadith, and I'm quoting hadith here, that people will kind of lose their mind to hear, like, because they will be like, what the hell is that on about? Because first of all, that it's haram, it's, there's no had going on, there's no this going on. And is this too not the Sharia, I'm asking? Because it's the action condoned by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, by his companion Ali. And it's so different to somebody saying, kill the people, kill everybody involved, kill the lady, and kill the three men. I mean, look how far up on one incident, the Prophet is laughing and saying, on the other incident, people are saying, no, let's kill, kill, kill. I mean, what is going on here? What is going on? Sorry, I've lost your. Is it on mute? It's not. Oh, right,
Oh,
I
can you hear
now.
me?
Sorry, I
Sorry
think it
about
got
that.
muted.
Yeah. Sorry about that. So this is one thing we have to recognize, that look, you have taken a hadith and you have given it an interpretation, and it just cannot be simply rejected. And therefore, this is one interpretation of religion. People would criticize you, but then they would have another reason. They would say, "Oh, this is khabr wahid. It goes against the mutawatir, which is the Quran, and therefore such and such."
And on that thing there,
Yeah.
and I know we've discussed this a bit earlier on, but it's so amazing that, and I'll accept this criticism, that people could say, well, look, fine, you're saying this about drawing lots, there's a hadith, it's in several books, Nasa'i, Abu Dawud, Al-Hakim, etc., but, we want to go with, we feel there's a contradiction with the verses or certain verses, but when we present to them the verse that there's no coercion in Islam, and a person is free to choose his faith, they say, but, here's a hadith in that, whosoever changes his deen, then kill him. And these apostasy laws, isn't this just people picking and choosing when they want? They will say, okay, the Quran revolves around the hadith, and when they don't want, they just find that hadith problematic. They'll say, shield it with a verse of the Quran.
Right. And this is what is transpiring. And therefore, so first we then have to recognize that Muslim as a community, they're shaping Islam. How the way they're looking at it, the usul, the principles they're using it, that is shaping Islam. I'll give you one thing which I want to share with you, and I think this is important to recognize, that when you mentioned this hadith, it reminded me of another narration, and we have heard about this, that there was a woman who was caught stealing, and some of the companions, they wanted to release her from it. They didn't want her to be punished, and it was said that if the daughter of the Prophet, right? There's this Sahih hadith. But here's another interesting thing. This is mentioned in Kitab al-Asar of Abu Hanifa. So there are two companions. So these two companions had they were the governors of two different places. So there was these individuals who were slaves at that time. They were brought, and these are two different episodes. They were brought to the companion, and the companions were told in different situations. So this is in other different regions, but the gist is the same. Is that basically those who caught these poor people, they were accusing them of stealing. So you know what the companions did? The companions said to these two people, like, say you didn't steal. And they said, no, we didn't steal. And then they were told, go, you have been freed. Now, I do wonder, why did they do that? Because maybe they recognize that, they're coming from a low income background. They may not have the courage to negate those who have caught them, because those who have caught them, they're coming from the high part of the society. And when the narration is mentioned where the Prophet ﷺ is saying that, he's trying to show that law is equal for everyone. But then these companions also recognize that those who are in this situation, they didn't have the opportunity. For example, they were trying to find excuses, because that is what part of also Islamic laws are, that you try to find excuses before punishing. So my point, what I'm trying to say is that all the time you would hear this one narration about like if someone does a crime, you must punish that. But you don't look at the practices of the companions as to how they deferred the punishment by using what? Let's be honest. This is a loophole. You are telling the person you haven't stolen, and she or and he says, "Oh, we haven't stolen," and therefore they're released. They're not given any punishment. But why did that happen? Perhaps it happened because they were coming from the lower part of the society.
Yeah. I mean,
So
it's interesting as well. Some people highlight, I was going through a particular book called In God's Path. And it's interesting that in that book, the author highlights that, you see, as Islam spread, he said that what's fascinating is that what do people think of Islam spreading? Like they have this impression that Islam comes and it does this makeover. And he says that, looking, and this is a non-Muslim, obviously, he says that from the historiographical, the archaeological, studying papyri, studying just other records that we can find, it's very clear that when Muslims arrived, the day before they arrived, the natives had rules and laws. Like naturally, they would have had a way of dealing, a way of doing treaties, a way of buying, selling. And when Islam landed there and took over in a position of power, the day after Islam was in control, they still had their previous rules and laws. And it's not how people think. That he said that it's, he said it's interesting that people think that Islam kind of comes and uproots this practice and puts in this practice. And he says that actually the papyri and all of these things are really fascinating, that he actually shows, in fact, he also quotes certain examples saying that, look, here is an example of some papyrus that is found slightly predating Islam from, let's say, the Middle East region on how certain people dealt with a particular issue. Now, let's say 100 years later, when Islam is there, that same ruling is there, except now that ruling is also allegedly part of the Sharia, or it's now a hadith. And he says, this is just very interesting, except, now they will just do the same things, but now they'll just say, well, the Prophet ﷺ said this. I mean, I'm not saying, obviously, that's his whole take. I'm not saying it's entirely like that, but it's interesting still, what he's pointing.
And so we can see that the indigenous culture that was present in those places, they were accepted. And unfortunately, now what we are seeing is that we have this notion that Islam is monolithic. So you'll see a lot of the subcontinent of the subcontinent form of Islam was heavily influenced by Persian culture. It was influenced by Ibn Arabi, Mullah Sadr, and all that. But just to see, for example, we do notice those who often become more religious, what type of dressing they're doing. A very, they will wear that
Jola type of,
Arab stuff. Yeah, exactly. That is not part of the subcontinent
फकीर आदमी
culture.
है झोला उठाकर चल पड़ेंगे वाह मोदी वाह
So this is very important to recognize that unfortunately we are now assuming that there's a certain form of Islam and that is it. The Islam that was being practiced in these Bengal to Balkan region in the pre-modern world, they had accepted their own culture, and yes, they would justify their culture through Islam because now they're trying to find a retroactive rationalization. It is what is happening even today. The notion of Islamic banking.
Exactly.
Right?
That's so well said. Yeah.
So this is what we have to recognize, that the reality of the Muslims once they're there. Now the next step is like, okay, we got to find some, for those who are fiqh minded, not for those who are like, they're like, we need to find some reason for that, and they will find a reason through ijtihad.
And by the way, this author is Hoyland, right? Robert Hoyland. So what's interesting as well is he highlights that he said that the Middle East, it seems very clear that the Middle East had a very it was familiar territory for for Islam, or if he doesn't use these words, but if I could say like almost like fertile ground, in the sense that they were mainly monotheistic people or people who were familiar with monotheism. So either Zoroastrian, or you've got Christian, heavily Christian, or the Jewish tradition. Whereas he says when Islam starts to go further east, like into the Balkh, into reaching South Asia, or beyond towards just Central Asia and things like this, those regions he mentions weren't actually familiar with this strict or this kind of monotheism the way the Middle East was familiar with it. And he says that in the Middle East, Islam was, to them, it was, on one hand, it had enough to be distinct. It had its own kind of thing, but at the same, on the same token, it had enough to be related to Christianity. So it was kind of like a distinct identity, but still a very familiar kind of identity. Whereas in the Balkh, or beyond, into Central Asia, those people, Islam was just an alien to them. So he highlights how things like Sufism and these kind of mystic, these kind of like supra-rational kind of interpretations played a very powerful role in kind of meshing Islam for those societies then.
Right. Exactly. And yes, that is true. So, for example, again, I'm quoting from the work of Shah Ahmad's What is Islam, the late scholar. May God bless him, have mercy on him. He was he did a pioneer work. This is interesting. People were not aware of the Sahih Sitta as we are today. We have these websites. We go and immediately find a hadith that justifies, or if we want to negate something, we'll find a refutation. They were more aware of what? Masnavi of Rumi. They were aware of Hafiz. For them, this is what Islam was. For the average Muslim, it was only a few, and in fact, even the fuqaha, they were not as well versed as into hadith, because then they had these mukhtasar types of books, right? Or they would have their own later fiqh books, the ones that were written by the mutakhirin. The point is that this mysticism, or you can say this esoteric Sufi perspective, then became part of the Muslim community. And it's because of that we don't find that there were such intolerant views that perhaps we are finding now that are emerging amongst those who take religion as very important in their lives. Yes, there were people of the past there as well, but they understood that within the they were not
to
aware
be clear
of
on
the
just a slight kind of addendum thing there, that not so much about whether they take Islam to be religion to be important, but how they stamp it out on other people.
So when I say religion is important, because now what has happened is that we're taking a very an approach that focuses on identity. So Islam becomes an identity. My identity then entails that I need to wear a certain Islamic libas. And so we would have scholars, we know in the past they would say wearing pant and shirt is forbidden. Yet the Prophet of Islam himself wore Roman clothes, for example, as mentioned in narration, right? So yet we connected by saying, oh, there's a narration that says you should not imitate the disbelievers. Yet the reality is that the Prophet of Islam wore Roman clothes.
Thought, just that thought. The Prophet dressed in Roman clothes. Like, this thought it's like a sledgehammer to the glass construct of so many kind of fundamentalists today. I just heard somebody sent me a clip today about certain preachers going on stamping on about tashabbah bil kuffar, anything that is seen as remotely resembling what the non-Muslims are known for, what they dress as, what they do in their haircuts, anything that is seen as resembling them, if you do it, that is then haram. And I just heard this clip today. Obviously, needless to say, I just laughed at it. But this thought that here is the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself dressed in Roman garb,
right? And secondly, one of my teachers, he told me one day that he said, Sayyid, the soap that they wear, this is actually bid'ah. I said, why? He said, how can, the companions, they were warriors. They went into battles. This common soap that they wear, this dasha, can they run in that? You know what they do? When they have to play soccer,
They
they have
have to
to
lift it.
uplift
Yeah,
it and then,
yeah.
right. So that was not the libas of the companions by any way. It wasn't. Because how would they
Yeah.
fight? Would they, uplift it and
That's
then
a very
fight?
good point,
So,
actually.
right. So,
Although some of them did fight like that if the fight broke out, and hence there is that poem and the whole thing on كشف إذا كشفت الساق عن حربها, that they would get ready to run. But you're right, generally, one would
they,
assume because they had, you know what they used to call the hulla, their suit of the day and age. And I know it involved obviously a lower garment, upper garment.
is,
The izar
yeah,
being like
yes,
the sarong thing underneath.
exactly.
The upper garment, I've never. That's interesting. I wonder how low it went then. It may have been like a
Right.
shirt or a
It's
kameez.
right, right. So that's the thing. They didn't wear this typical one dress.
Mm,
They had that izar and the upper dress as well. For example, in Pakistan, we have that izar that some
mm-hmm.
people wear in the
Yeah,
rural
yeah.
area. Something akin to that would make sense. But that's my point. Now, why, I'll take another example. There's so much focus on the notion of bid'ah, innovation. There's a certain style that people wear on the
Mm,
top. As correct me if I'm wrong, it was the companions used to wear a
yeah.
turban, and again, the turban is not a sunnah for some. They didn't wear
No.
this way, and yet there's so much focus on that. If anyone keeps a different dress, it's like when you wear a Western dress, then oh, you are doing an imitation. Well, based on the logic of the notion of bid'ah, wearing such cloth, that gadra, whatever you call it, isn't that
The
bid'ah? So
exactly the golf kind of attire. Yeah,
right, right. But the thing is that we don't call these bid or something. These are
of
culture
course.
dresses, and every community has that, and we recognize that. So it seems very absurd then if someone would say, let's live in the West, but let's wear, for example, our own culture clothes.
Yeah,
It's quite
because I
problematic to say, and the reason is that it's mushabia, it's imitation with the non-Muslims. And then
yeah.
one more thing I do want to mention. There are a lot of times people criticize the non-Muslim, but wasn't there a narration narrated by Amr al-As radiallahu anhu who said about the Byzantine, the Romans, that they have three good qualities? One of those qualities, what that they stand up to their oppressed leaders, and we do notice that
Mm,
within the Western
wow.
society. So, right, there was that, and they're the first people, if disaster happens, they're able to recover from it, and they give the poor and the charities. This is a Sahih,
Wow.
and this is not my narration. So, my point is that what is happening is that unfortunately, because of this miscommunication, not being able to interact with people, we are creating these types of
Just
interpretations.
today, the lecture I was listening to, I mean, this particular one, somebody actually sent it to me because it was a podcast. I didn't recognize the other people, but it had Dawaman in there, and it was about three, four other guys, and they were just speaking about different topics. Oh, that's it. It's called Chai with Bhai or something, but there was no chai there. But but anyway, they were. But there's a particular point where they're speaking about dress and haircuts. So one of the other guys, I don't know who he is, but he alludes to me, and hence somebody sent it to me saying, "Hey, check this out." And the guy says, "Well, there's some people today who would claim that they are of knowledge, yet claim a title, yet they'll have a chain on and they'll have like a fade haircut and so on." But the discussion then carries on. They don't focus on me, but they just carry on talking, and the things that were being said were that, you see, they acknowledge that it's not haram to wear regular clothes, like, t-shirt, trousers, whatever, but they say that if we had, why do we want to wear a thobe? They say we want to wear a thobe, and I think Dawaman says that he holds a circle or something, and if anybody comes there that does not have a thobe, they get, that they're not allowed. And he says the reason being because he says we want to wear a thobe because this is the dress of the people of knowledge. And I just found that very fascinating because I thought, what? The people of knowledge? Who the hell are they? I mean, how has that been restricted to the Gulf? I mean, I don't get, like, I'm
Right.
not saying there's no people of knowledge in the Gulf. There are, but people of knowledge exist all around the world. There's no such thing as the people of knowledge are those who wear a lungi, or wear a dhoti, and that they're the people of knowledge. So, I mean, this just coming back to what you're saying, that this definition that we decide something, we then make that the thing, and then we justify it by that same thing. We just say, well, why we do this is because the people of knowledge wear this, and the people of knowledge, well, it's their cultural dress anyway.
What is interesting is that, and when we look at people who hold such views, well, such views, these people, they're sheikhs or they're people of knowledge. They were of the view 10 years back that camera, TV, videos, all of this is haram. And yet we are now noticing that all of them are coming on videos. So this shows the problem in how they're defining knowledge. It's simply that whatever the sheikh says, that is what we're going to accept it. Let's be honest, a lot of scholars in the Gulf, dare I say majority of them were of the view initially that taking pictures or having videos is completely prohibited. Yet when they found the benefit of that, and unfortunately we have to recognize benefit is not simply saying, oh, I'm going to spread Islam. There's also that
I was going to say
monetary.
that, you see, I would translate what you're saying, benefit there, as currency. Like
Right.
when they found they were at a loss, unless
Yes.
unless you start taking photos, unless you make videos of yourself, nobody's going to go to you. This is that, I don't, it's, yeah.
Right. So if I may add, so this is a form of social
Yeah,
capital.
exactly.
Social capital, not actual
Yeah,
capital. That basically,
excellent.
because when they're going to come to some European country, everyone is going to be treating them nicely. They're going to be sitting in a nice car and everything. I'm not saying that this is a general way of saying, but I'm saying certainly that there is that element that can be present. So this is a form of, for a lot of average Muslims, like they do ask this question, okay, suddenly they're coming on TVs, suddenly they have all these smiley pictures, white background. How did that become permissible when you were saying 10 years back it was completely
Yeah.
forbidden? Now, right? So now what happens is that people like, unfortunately, who are their followers and saying that this is people of knowledge, I'm sorry, but like you have scholars who are Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, he wears pant and shirt. But what would happen is that like people like Sheikh Hamza Yusuf would be considered as deviant, as Sufis, and all such. But here's the problem. A lot of people don't recognize, and this is especially an issue with the Salafia movement, is that rulings are also shaped by the political dimensions or the political reality of the present of the time they are found in. So, for example, women cannot drive. 10 years back, that was the ruling. Suddenly you find a fatwa, oh no, women can drive. In fact, it is good,
I
right?
found that
So
to be
again,
the
this is
dumbest of all fatwas,
yes.
Honestly, amongst the dumbest I have to put out there, that women can't drive. I don't mean in a capacity sense that it's haram for them to not be able to drive. Because basically, God will throw them in the hellfire for driving a car.
And so that is the thing that are not people are not people so aware, self-conscious, self-reflective to think that how is it possible that these same people they're holding as people of knowledge might hold a view and suddenly they change because of the political influence that is happening. This is the problem that happens, that when we consider people as what, not recognizing they have done a lot of good, but they're also human beings having their own limitations. And so this is important, that the past scholars, for example, they wouldn't blindly follow anyone. They would criticize, they would follow even Imam Muhammad and Abu Yusuf. They would critique Abu Hanifa.
Mm,
They wouldn't agree with
yeah.
him. They would say, Abu Hanifa said that, I think this is the view.
And I know you've done a lot of work in this as well, and we spoke earlier on that they would be sometimes, and they still are, very accommodating when it comes to their own self-interest, and at times male interest, because the fuqaha by and large are generally men. Now, I mean, it's not, women can become fuqaha, but the way it generally is a very male-driven kind of field, or institution. So there's a lot of rulings accommodating for men. A lot of the script has been written to accommodate for men, just sexual needs, things like this. Now, when it comes to women, it's not like those rulings don't exist in Islam. Isn't that the case? But there's very accommodating rulings for women that will exist in every single topic that you can imagine. Is that not the
Right.
case?
Right. So what we have to recognize that the pre-modern world religions, and it doesn't include Islam, it includes all major religions, they were significantly influenced by the patriarchal structure that was present at that time. So we have to recognize that the society, or the interpretations were very androcentric. By andro means male, so male-centric. Now the
Follow.
reality,
No, I'm joking. Freud would put it
so
that way, but yeah.
yeah. Okay, so we need to recognize that male centric, and that men, and remember, men were the interpreters, heterosexual male were the interpreters, not women, in generally speaking. So what has happened is that I'll give you an example, and this is what has happened, and this is what then people observe and start think about it. So you will find rulings for a Muslim man saying that okay, when it comes to beard, there's khilaf. You can keep a more than one fist, you can keep one fist, you can keep a chin strap, you can have
Got
this
you.
one, and you don't even need to keep this one. Exactly. Why? So what happens? You are giving leeway, flexibility to Muslim men to be part of the society. But for a Muslim woman, it's like, no, you have to wear a niqab, and if not, then hijab. Well, here's the issue. In the tafsir of Ibn Ashur, he says, Qila, that there are some who have given permission. So why not? Why not take this view when you can find views from men that makes them it makes their life easy? Secondly, we have to recognize that when it comes
And
to these
just on
issues,
that note, just so
yeah,
people are aware that what you're saying about Ibn Ashur, that what we're discussing is the issue of hijab. That hijab, what we're calling
right,
hijab, the head covering, the khimar, that there has been some difference, but it's been kind of like it's been drowned out, or attempts to drown it out. But scholars have said
yes,
that, look, a woman, she doesn't have to cover, or they've kind of alluded to that difference, but it's not capitalized, even though this ruling of the woman covering her hair is not explicitly found in the Quran or Sunnah. One could say it's alluded to, or it's inferred from certain the verses of al yadribna, bikhumrihinna, but it's not explicitly found. So one might assume that where something isn't explicit, people are more willing to exercise a kind of leniency.
right. Another thing we need to recognize that when it comes to these things, this topic should be dealt by Muslim women. Unfortunately, it is the Muslim man who is defining the parameters of hijab and niqab. It is the Muslim woman who should be discussing about these issues and women-related issues. Why is it that men have not experienced giving birth? It is women who experiences being a mother, giving birth, going through all the different physiological changes. Yet we find men are doing that, and so there's that patriarchal reality which we have to take into consideration. I'll give you another example of how this views that we're talking about, they became normative, that you have to cover your hair. Ibn Ashur, what he's presenting becomes ashaz, a rare view. I'll give you another example about woman's testimony. The pre-modern Muslim fuqaha, as mentioned by Badruddin al-Aini in his Umdatul Qari, in his Sharh of Bukhari, Umdatul Qari, in his Sharh al-Bukhari, he said that the majority of scholars held the view that a woman's testimony is not acceptable in hudud.
Mm.
Okay, this is what
Hudud
he
is
said.
like punishments and things like this. Yeah.
Right. Now, interestingly, yes, this might be the case, but Tawus, and this is in Musannaf Abdul Razzaq, he said that a woman's testimony is acceptable in all conditions, except that he didn't prefer that they should see, he didn't feel that it's right that a woman should see uh, some two people committing, having an affair, right? But the point is, he didn't say because of for some intellectual level, as unfortunately we have these people who argue for that. No. Yet my question then is, why was this opinion ignored, and why did this other opinion become the normative interpretation in the community? Isn't it a crime that a woman's testimony is not accepted if for like this has happened unfortunately in Pakistan?
Okay.
I'll give you
I
another
thought
example.
the Hanafis,
Yeah.
that the Hanafis were kind of accommodating on that
They
issue. I thought.
they do it through loophole
Mm.
to ta'wil, but the point is the Hanafis also say when it comes to hudud laws, women's testimony is not acceptable, and that's why there was this reaction by the progressive movements against Zia al-Haq's hudud ordinance. So we have to recognize these are the problems. I'll give you another example. You know, in the Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 282, the ayat regarding dain, debt, the about business transactions. What is interesting is that
Sorry, no, that's just yeah.
yeah,
Can you hear it as well?
I can I can hear it. It's like
I
someone is
think so.
vacuuming or
That's It's a
something.
very odd time to be vacuuming, but yeah, carry on.
Okay. Sure. So that ayat, and this is what the scholars, and this is good. These views that I'm presenting, they are coming from Muslim female
Mhm.
scholars. We need the voices of Muslim women so that it becomes part of this discourse because unfortunately there has been too much emphasis of men's interpretation. So now what has happened is that this ayat of Dain, that it was related to business transaction, yet the scholars connected it. And how did they connect? They said basically a woman's testimony is not acceptable except in business transactions. So they had already a prior assumption that woman's testimony is not acceptable except this because the Quran allows. Why did that emerge? Unfortunately, there was that patriarchal attitude that was present at that time. One cannot just deny that. Take another example. We have in terms of the relation, the marriage, the general interpretation of the past was done through the notion of qawamun, men are protectors. However, this verse has only been said once that men are protectors in relation to women. Why did not the scholars of that time use the concepts such as ma'ruf, rahma, wa mawadda? Because they have been mentioned more than 20 times in the Quran. And then based on that, how they connected the notion that the idea of marriage is that a woman and a man, basically man can have relationship with woman and in return she will be able to get housing and such. Now these types of interpretations cannot be accepted in 21st century. And the reason they came was because men were giving their interpretation. So this is something that we need to also look at.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, I, yeah. I mean, do you feel as well that that the sciences in and of themselves, fiqh, sharia, that these things don't attract women to it? Do you feel that as well, or is it just that they are? Why are there not as many women in this field?
The reason is that a lot of them initially when they start, so we have some people who were really the well, I'm not going to share those experiences, but the thing is that because I would need their permission, but what I can say in a general sense is that many of them, for example, they want to study Islam, but when they look at the issues, how the fiqh has dealt with women, it becomes really disheartening. So, for example, if you look at the issue of compensation, unintentional homicide, for example, now if a man is killed, the compensation is more than compared to a woman's blood money. That is, the blood money idea, the compensation that would be half. So the thing is that they find these types of interpretations as problematic. But having said that, once they do read this, they are coming up with their own interpretations and challenging these patriarchal reading. Like Dr. Asma Burles, she has written a book, Unreading that Patriarchal Interpretation of Islam or of the Quran, something like that along that line. So what is at least happening is that while there are few, those who are delving into it, they are challenging this. Now again, I know people would say that these opinions, they are feminist opinion, they're this and that. I'm sorry, this is the way to negate. This is simply one is negating what is happening in the ground. The reality is that at least in North America, Muslim women are standing up and challenging these patriarchal interpretations, and which is good.
I mean, but it's seen
So
as
yeah,
in those cases, it's seen
yeah.
as kind of like trying to subvert, like an insurgency. People see it as very rebellious. But because I was asked. I mean, on going back to that question, I was asked recently that why are the
Sorry, can I just add
yeah, of
one thing?
course,
Just
of course.
reminded me. Dr. Akram Nadawi wrote a book, Al Muhaddisat, Women Scholars. And just to give you is that this is the problem that a lot of times those who are more religious don't recognize. You had female muhaddisat, the female hadith scholars, who would sit where the Prophet of Islam is resting, and they would give ijaza to men. And today you have an issue of coeducation. You can't have coeducation. So my point is that still, at least in the past, there was also the recognition that women could be a scholar. Now we have this hyper masculine approach towards religion, which is becoming problematic for a number of Muslim women. And we have to think that into consideration. Sorry, I interrupted you, but please go
No,
ahead.
no, not at all. I was just curious from a sociological perspective as well. That I was asked recently that why are these fields male dominated, and I felt that okay. I mean, it's admissible that historically, things were disadvantageous for women to kind of participate in, but today, especially in the West, for example, that's not the case. But why still? And I felt that the field of Islamic law is a bit like the STEM kind of fields, that uh, it doesn't draw as many females to it as it does males. That the female mind generally is not. It doesn't find it as appealing. So for example, research in a lot of European countries has shown, given an equal platform, women still tend not to go towards the kind of STEM fields like mathematics and engineering and stuff like this, whereas men do, and women tend to go towards other fields, even given an egalitarian approach. I felt that the Sharia is a bit like that as well. Like, I think it's a bit dry for.
I would take a different approach, and even when you talk about the STEM research, while might be saying that that is not the case. I mean, not all research shows that. And secondly, we have to take into consideration socialization. So if you're controlling for everything, but there's a socialization aspect. So from a young age, this is what research also shows, that females are motivated to do something else. They're not focused. They're not motivated by their parents and relatives to go into STEM. So that
Do you not feel
component is
that?
missing at times in the
Do you
research.
not feel that the male and the female psyche and the brain, not from an egalitarian perspective, but from a kind of from its kind of proclivities and modality perspective, do you not feel that they are different?
No, no. The reason I say is that because socialization has a lot of significance, how a mind
But
develops, and the
a lot
notion
of
is
the
immediately
research would be against that, wouldn't it?
not really. A lot of contemporary research would be that there's the notion that there isn't any essential difference. It is being influenced by the socialization process that is affecting from an early age. For example, sorry,
No,
go
I'm
ahead.
just curious because would
So yeah.
so you would feel that, given, let's say, men's, and this isn't about the biological structure of size, but more about modalities and the way they construct the world, is identical to females.
So yes, I would say that we cannot give an essential differentiation between genders. We have to recognize there is
So,
a
so for
socialization
example,
component.
the male
Yeah.
brain does have more dedicated to visual spatial areas. There's also androgynous, the areas that have been impacted by the androgynous kind of receptors, with all the testosterone that females generally wouldn't have. But even in other aspects, there is a difference. I would assume that that is quite biological, but it's not. I'm not saying a difference is that one. I'm not trying to say that these are better than them, but I would assume that the brains are not identical.
Even if they're not identical, I would still suggest that how your socialization process happened, that has a more impact. It is like the tabula rasa, and how that tabula rasa is then being added to that by the ideas and the forms that are being given, that has a more stronger influence on one's outcome. So this is one approach that is taken for the STEM difference that you have mentioned.
Would you
There
feel
are
that,
those who would,
given an
yeah.
equal plane, men and women would be equally drawn towards things like, let's say, more nurturing fields?
I believe so.
You
Yes,
think so?
I believe that, I think so. So, for example, why is it that women they become teachers at an elementary school and men are not? It's not because, men cannot have a more nurturing personality. It is that from a very young age, men are told to be tough, to cover their, they can't show their feelings. We have words in Urdu, unfortunately, we use, don't, ke ladke bano,
Mhm.
don't cry. So those things have to be taken into consideration. That is why I'm not, for me, it is very difficult to take this essentialist approach of
Mhm.
differentiation, because then this was also used, unfortunately, based on that, then this can also be used for giving a very misogynistic interpretation of religion, which has been utilized then.
I mean, because I'm not
So,
saying that there's
yeah,
no
yeah,
socialization. I would
yeah,
feel that there is definitely socialization does exist. But I would
right.
feel that given an equal plane, men and women, not always, but in several occasions, would drift in different directions. That men would be driven generally for certain things. I feel that there would be a huge socialization aspect to that as well. But let's say, for example, the nurturing aspect that we spoke of.
Yeah.
I would feel that women inherently are more driven towards a kind of a motherhood, that they would have this kind of more nurturing soul to them by default. I'm not saying men are not incapable of nurturing, but I would feel that then that it wouldn't be an equal plane. That even if they were all the same, like let's say you had 100 men, 100 women, and they were all treated equally, I don't think 100, like the majority of the men would grow up thinking, "Oh, I just want to," being so care. I think that testosterone in them would still bring out that side, the different kind of that there's a kind of like like an aggression, the kind of, which you see, the aggression and these things can't go hand in hand with as much nurturing. Like you can't be as
Okay.
aggressive as awesomely nurturing, and like these are kind of counterparts. And I feel that I
Hmm.
don't know what I take it you would disagree.
Yeah, yeah. I would, because the thing is that, I would counter argue and say, like, okay, this notion of being an angry young man, again, it's a socialization process that is happening. My argument would be more to that whether like the stem, I would say the reality is that Muslim women have not been allowed to enter this fiqh, into this world of fiqh. Clearly, they were not. We know as a fact that even Muqtasa al-Qudri, the al-Qudri, for example, I think it was him that he would go and ask his wife about issues about certain issues, and she would give him the views, and then he would come to his students and say that this is the opinion, and then they found out that he's going to his wife. The point is that we have unfortunately created these gates whereby we're not allowing Muslim women to enter certain fields. And in fact, Dr. Aisha Chaudhry has written an article on this regarding, we do have, even the Islamic studies has different forms of approaches. One is the Orientalist approach, but then there's the patriarchal approach. Now there's a new form that is emerging, the intersectionalist approach. Intersectionality is a theory that is whereby there are minorities that are coming into this. That is people of color, women, and such. Those who may not hold normative opinions, for example. And this is part of the discourse that is happening. So this is something I think that is important to recognize. Another
No,
thing is,
no, no.
sorry, go ahead.
Finish that. Then I've just got a point going
Yeah,
back to. But yeah.
yeah. Another thing we have to recognize is that many of them have entered this, but then they are not taking this very classical approach whereby they're talking fiqh from this traditional way as we are defining. They're actually looking at it from a different way now. They are criticizing this form of fiqh that emerged in the
Mm,
past. And the reason now they're not being recognized is that partially maybe it is also the reason that population are not taking them
I see.
seriously. We still have, unfortunately, idea that a sheikh is someone who wears a thobe and has a big
Yeah.
beard. For many people, it's difficult to recognize a Muslim female scholar who, for example, does not wear a hijab. And I'll give you an example that the author Aisha Chaudhry shared in her article, that same one. So she said that basically she went to Morocco to discuss about, she was in a panel regarding women's right, and there was the sheikh who comes and he's trained from Jamil Azhar. He has this beads, the typical how you have people carrying beads. And first thing, he felt uncomfortable because she doesn't wear a hijab. And when she started questioning him, started giving a different viewpoint, he got upset and he is like, I'm the sheikh, you should listen
Mm,
to me. You are not. So he was trying to lower them by saying, look, I'm qualified based on what? Way he was dressed and studying from Jam al Azhar. And because Dr. Aisha hasn't studied from an institution, so except she has done a PhD from an Ivy League, that is the University of Toronto. My point, what I'm trying to say is that what I'm trying to say, which is important, is to recognize that this sheikh, because he was being questioned by a woman, he wasn't able to accept
No, I
authority.
agree with you. On that. I 100% agree, and I think that is just that is clearly cultural, and that is people. It's a dent to the ego, and then they feel. I think it's a dent to the ego to be undermined anyway, and then more so when you think the other person, you're judgmental in thinking the other person doesn't. He doesn't even look the part, and even more so if you're very sexist to think from that gender, like a woman. I agree with definitely with that. I on just a tangent, going back to that discussion, since your area of research is sociology, I'm curious, with this the kind of egalitarian tabula rasa, clean slate perspective, would you feel that women? So, for example, um, this side to women, let's say this side that we see in society, that let's say there's more a preponderance to nurture, to be caring, be emotional, to be in contact with the emotions, that kind of side that is in society, this kind of narrative. Uh, do you not feel that should be the case then, or do you feel that women should continue to be like that, or should they kind of go more to it?
Right.
Because there's this image that, like, let's say men are not as in touch with their emotions, and there's this discourse that men
Mm.
should be more in touch, but women, let's say, are generally seen as, like, in society, or as being very emotional, or they're being very nurturing, or they're being very, let's say, do you feel that should be then brought down?
So what first I would say is that, for example, the notion women are emotional, that has actually been justified to say why their testimony is not
Mm.
acceptable. So that is one issue that I have when we generalize. Secondly,
So
I
I
would
don't
say
mean by
that
here,
yeah,
by the way, I'm
yeah,
not saying the,
right,
like people just diss women in saying,
right,
well, they're just emotional.
right,
I don't mean in that sense, but the general
okay,
social archetype of the female,
right,
that is
right,
this kind of nurturing, loving, or let's say this caring, this kind of mamta,
ah,
this kind of
right,
side that you see.
right.
Are you saying
My
that should be
right.
dulled down to new? Yeah,
What I'm saying is, yeah, what I'm saying is that it is a woman's agency. It is her right to decide what she wants to do and how she wants to
true.
be. It is not the domain of men, as in myself, to say, oh, this is what I want. I should accept however they want to define
That is
themselves.
true, but would you feel okay? Let's say, would you feel a woman that had, let's say, less of that side of this kind of femininity, which is to some extent socially constructed, and some extent I would argue it's natural, but to some great extent, but people might challenge that. Wait a minute. Let's get your take quickly on that. Do you feel femininity is constructed?
Yes.
Constructed. Okay, socially.
Yeah. It's there is that social construction element to that. And I just want to say, like, when we're talking about this gender, look, we have to recognize even the gender has a traditional understanding to it. The notion of masculinity, for example, that is a gender construction. It is important to recognize that the traditional notion of this gender binary does not exist anymore in the contemporary world. And it's important to recognize that the person, the way they're defining themselves, we have to accept
Okay.
them.
No, okay, that
Because,
part's true,
yeah,
how they're doing it. But
right.
let's say, would
Yeah.
you find, do you think in society, like you would find women, I mean, would you find that appealing to you as being a man, being on this side of the the fence, so to speak? Would you see a woman with, like, lacking or less femininity as a more true archetype, or something appealing to you as a man?
So, so for me, what would be if a person wants to define themselves as
Mm-hmm.
a woman, I would
Mm-hmm.
accept that. I'm not going to feel like, oh, they have less or more. I
But
have
would you?
to
What would you
recognize
find
that
more?
this is how.
Because would you not? Because if I understand that there's a certain amount which is going to be socially, designed, but a woman, let's say, not that's not feminine, because I would, as a person, I would find femininity incredibly attractive as a feature. Uh,
And that's your
yeah,
perspective. Maybe for some they don't have that perspective. And if one, so this is what we have to recognize. For some, that may not be the
but
case.
you don't feel that
They
these
are,
things, to a great extent, are just in nature, because animals have male and female, and they attract. Obviously, they see femininity and they see masculinity. They haven't been socialized through that sense. It's just part of the.
yeah, that may be the case, but then we are also different from animals. We are a species that are way more highly developed in terms of our cognitive processes as well. So for me personally, yeah, I have a when you're asking about my personal opinion, like I said, for me the main thing is that if someone is defining themselves from a gender, whatever gender they have, whether they call themselves as binary, transsexual, transgender, if whatever they are comfortable with, I will recognize them for that. And there is a reason why. Because I myself am coming from a minority faith. If I'm getting that recognition
Mhm.
from the LGBT community, for example, so I would have to recognize them as
Sure.
well. And in fact, this is what is happening within the
I mean,
Muslim contemporary
I'm not
discourse itself.
disagreeing with. You see, like, if, let's say, there was a man who is effeminate, or there's a woman who is very kind of masculine in her approach. Now, I don't have a problem with them. I'm not going to be like, oh, what the hell are you, why are you like this? I would accept them however they are. I'm not going to discriminate. But do I, as a person, feel society should move in a direction where they neutralize these aspects of masculinity and femininity? I don't personally feel that society should do that, but because I feel that these aspects are, like, I mean, if people chose to do that individually, I would, you know, I wouldn't discriminate against them. I would accept that's their choice. But do I feel society as a whole should move towards a gender neutrality?
Generally, we have to recognize that sometimes what the society decides can become another form of tyranny.
Mm,
So, for example, let's take the example of tattoos. In the past, in Canada, if someone had a tattoo, he or she wouldn't get a job. So this is very important to recognize that when we're talking about the how should the society decide, it can lead to tyranny as
true.
well. And these are discourses that have to happen through dialogues and coming to a consensus whereby we make sure that the minority of any form of minority is not, they're not losing their right. That is important to recognize.
Absolutely. I mean, this is hypothetically. We wouldn't be able to, you and I, we wouldn't be able to influence society in that way. I don't think individual people would. But let's say if, let's say we had, this is just a kind of like a thought experiment. If it were up to me, let's say, do I feel it should? Not that I'm forcing people, but do I feel society should move towards a gender neutral? So there's masculinity and femininity have faded away. There's just, maybe, but if you want to say anatomically male, and anatomically female individuals exist, but there is nobody behaves effeminately, nobody behaves in a masculine way. It's just neutral. Do you, like, I don't think I would find that a nightmare as a person.
Mm.
I wonder what
The
you
thing is
think.
that the thing is you're not going to find something like this
Mm,
happening because everyone is
yeah,
different in terms of how they're going through their socialization process. But having said that, this should not become a way like if someone doesn't want to identify themselves with gender, for example, then we're like, no, this is not right. How the person feels comfortable, and if the society then decides, at the end of the day, we have to recognize that the society evolved based on how the community or the population of that society is looking at. So, we have to recognize that. In fact, we are seeing this changes even amongst the American Muslims in terms of how their views regarding these types of topics are
yeah.
evolving. Right? So, for example, and I'm just going to give you an
Okay,
interesting
go for it.
data.
Go for it.
10 years back, for example, in 2007, the question was asked, should societies support homosexuality or should society discourage? 30% or something like that
This
said that. And
this
this is
is
Pew survey.
Muslim, non-Muslim. This is just generic survey.
So this is Muslims in the
Okay.
US. They were asked that should society support homosexuality. 30%, or some said that. Today, more than 50% are of the view that the society should accept, not support, sorry, should accept homosexuality. Now, my point is that this is the difference that is emerging, and then you're seeing different discourses that are transpiring. You have some people who would say that, in Islam it's not allowed, but we're living in a secular state, and therefore we should support as a minority. Some are challenging the pre-modern interpretations. Some are still not agreeing. But this is what happens, that values, constructions of values happens through dialogues. Now, I just want to, like, on this issue of the, about homosexuality, there are different opinions now that are emerging within American Muslim
Yeah.
discourse.
I mean, I was
It is
asked about that as well, and I made a video basically saying that, look, some ulama in Islam, it is a minority opinion, but some ulama in Islam did say homosexuality was fine. Now, I said that, look, if somebody chooses to follow that, that's their business, and let people be. I did say that let people be. You shouldn't
right.
harass people.
And for a sociologist, what would be interesting is that why would a person like Mufti Abu Layth come to this? Because questions were coming to him. So the community becomes that Mustafti is asking a Mufti to provide a fatwa. And so this is that sociological process, or the change of socio-economic environment, that is influencing different forms of interpretations of Islam. So therefore, then to condemn and say, oh, Islam is against this group or that group becomes problematic, because you, for example, you are a reaction or an outcome to what the community is asking. Jonathan Brown has written an article, and he got a lot of criticism from certain individuals. He came up with this view. So he
Danny
came
boy.
up with, because he, no. So he came up with a lot of, he came up with his justification, quoting Ibn Qayyim, for example. This is how discourses transpire. Now, at the same time, you have some, and majority of them in the Muslim world, they still don't accept this. But as we learn more, as we engage more, as we go into the uncharted territories, we are going to find things that we're explaining, we're talking about, we're forming views that were not present in the past.
And I agree with you, Doc. I mean, like, if we look at, like, let's say growing up in the 80s, I'm probably older than you, Doc, but let's say as a kid, I was a kid in the 80s, and growing up in the 90s, homophobic remarks, for example, were very commonplace. Yeah, most jokes were like that. In fact, when I was growing up, and even till after, it was very common to say things were like, oh, like if you diss something, oh, that's gay. They would say that and make a lot of these kind of jokes. Society as a whole, the social consciousness of society is kind of shifted now. People, some people might still, do that, but a lot of people now recognize the offensive nature. Just as when we were kids in the 80s, racism was commonplace, and people, they would say Paki this, Paki that, all this kind of stuff, say to black people, the N-word, this, that. It was like very common here in the UK in the 80s. Now, that's just me being a kid. I mean, but as I was a teenager in the 90s, even then it was actually around, but by the 2000s, it definitely has kind of gone. Like, people, in fact, if a person, if you said to a person, like now, or even, since like a decade, if you said to somebody, racist, they would get very offended. That, like, even if the person was about to have a fight with you about something, and you said, like, you racist, this, and the person would be extra offended. How dare you call me racist? Like, it's now permeated the social consciousness that racism is unacceptable. And I think that's a great achievement. And in a similar way, it's what's kind of growing is this understanding of this homophobia, that, like, people are homosexual. We shouldn't kind of, we shouldn't persecute them. We shouldn't diss them. We shouldn't kind of do this kind of stuff. We shouldn't just, make life hell for them. Now, what I'm intrigued by is, I find this a more Western phenomenon, Western Muslim phenomenon, that they are very strongly, that many, not all, many very strongly homophobic. Like they have to make a point about it all the time. Now, when I was in Pakistan, I spent many years in Pakistan. I studied in the Middle East, in Syria. I've visited other places as well, but those places I studied, spent years and years there. Religiously, they held very similar views. They were, not accepting of, let's say, homosexuality at an official level, but there wasn't this kind of like this kind of active hatred. Like there was just like in Pakistan, they would just kind of mock it, and they, it's seen as like, oh yeah, like they would, they say gandu, this, that, and they just mock it, but they wouldn't. There isn't this kind of thing like, oh my god, let's go attack that person, or they hate this proactive hate. Why has that been triggered in Western Muslims?
Right. So, first of all, we one thing has to be noticed is that unfortunately there is a segment within the Muslim community who hold who hold homo negative attitudes, homophobic attitudes, and that's a sad thing, because the reality is that, and this is, one has to recognize this. A lot of times, in many instances, it is the LGBT community that comes in the defense of Muslim minorities in the West. And yet, unfortunately, when we hold these views that are very homo-negative, that's not conducive for a healthy dialogue. Having said that, also we need to recognize that this change amongst American Muslims, that the majority of them are now embracing more positive, or this more they are supporting homosexual rights, is a positive thing. In that sense, they're recognizing their how the system, how their experiences are making them evolve into recognizing that just as we are minorities, they should also be given the rights. So this itself, this data, it's quite interesting to notice that more than 50% of American Muslims support homosexual rights. Having said that, we also have now Muslims, like people who are, they are Muslim scholars and they're gays as well. So we are having a unique form within West, at least in North America. Now, the reason that when you're saying, oh, some of the Western Muslims may hold intolerant views, well, it also matters depending on the economic situation. What data shows, and there has been a research on that. I have an article right in front of me: economic inequality and intolerance attitudes towards homosexuality in 35 democracies, but this is not done for the Muslim survey. It's just done for different countries.
Are you saying economic as in the poorer they are, the more? Is that what you're saying?
So what research shows is that those who are established, economically speaking, what happens is that when you are in a country like that is economically struggling, you're more focused towards your own meeting your material wealth, meeting your material needs. That is you need a house and everything. So if you see anything that is different, you start to fear that differenceness, that differentiation. This is what happens in a lot of countries that are economically struggling. They start to criticize others. I do wonder whether Pakistan is that reason that you're seeing these types of religious intolerance, because there's the economic difficulties that individuals are facing, right? So now what happens is that once you're in an economic developed country and you are prosperous as well, not just the country, but you as well, that now you don't have those material concerns, you shift to non-material concerns. That you're shifting towards those things that you feel are going to make the society a more just. So you're focused on social justice. Why are American Muslims more supportive of homosexual rights? It's because of them as a community. Generally, they're in the upper level in terms of the income groups. If you look at other groups, other communities, they tend to be on the higher level. But if you would see the European Muslims, like in France, at times they're struggling. Like in UK, there is that struggling phase as well. So to argue that it's Western Muslims hold that, no, it is to see, okay, generally those are holding strict views, are they coming from the lower income group? Because if you look at American Muslims who are more settled, more established, they are tending to have more open views. And that is why you're seeing articles written by al-Yaqeen. They're being written by who? Correct me if I'm mistaken, but they're coming
if that
from North
be the
America.
case, then, Doc, then the Muslim world ought to be very preoccupied with this topic of homosexuality. But actually, it isn't.
It isn't, because it's not in the right now. A, because generally you have your cultural, historical, what do you call forces, factors involved
Mhm.
as well. These things are not discussed because they're considered as taboo.
But
That's
you
another thing.
see, I mean, you've lived in Pakistan. I've
Yeah.
lived in Pakistan. I had a Pakistani doctor, psychiatrist on as well, Dr. Yusuf Raza, in one of the episodes, and we touched up a bit on this topic as well. Uh, it's interesting. I actually feel that there's a greater. Sorry, I was just looking for a book as well. I just brought a book the other day by. It's a really fascinating book by Dr. What's her name? Madhavi Menon, an Indian who's written on the sexual, um, what the kind of, I don't know the term she uses, but which I suppose I was going to say fluidity, but that could be interpreted in other ways. But the
Mm,
kind of the impermanence of the sexual nature, the flexibility, the agility of people's sexuality in the Indian subcontinent. She's done extensive research on it, and she's got several lectures. Now, she actually highlights how uh, she's not a Muslim, but she highlights the Islamic part in that as well. Like she mentions how a lot of the Sufi shrines and the Sufi saints, they would have this kind of gender fluidity, that they would dress up as the dulhan of the full-on saint, and the, being the, and in a lot of the poetry as well, you get Amir Khusro and other people speaking in a feminine form for the saint. Now, the, you see in countries like Pakistan even today, I would argue that there is a much greater fluidity, actually, of sexuality, that they're not actually, like guys will always go holding hands with each other and doing all the, which people here are much more, they find that gay, basically. If you're just sitting there and your guy friend just held your hand, you're gonna be like,
mm,
"Acha, ye ka ho raha hai yahan pe?"
mm. Uh, One thing, there's one book I would recommend. It's written by Dr. Scott Kugel, Homosexuality in Islam. So he talks about, again, you're seeing he's an American Muslim convert, and he's talking about, and he's a gay Muslim, and it's a really interesting book. So what we're noticing is that why has this emerging? Because people are trying to find an Islamic ruling or justifying, right? But when you're talking about the past, and by justification, I'm saying again, we're having this reality and we try to find some sources within the text to justify whatever
Mm.
position one is taking. So, part of my sociological training is not to say which is right or
Of
wrong,
course,
it's
yeah.
simply to observe what is happening as a phenomena. The Muslim world, as you're saying, you notice one thing I noticed, you're saying they're going to these Sufi shrines. And that's the thing that when I was talking about this Balkan to Bengal region, there was this, it wasn't a very fiqh oriented Muslim community in the past. Like today we are. We are
Mm.
hypersensitive. Is this halal? Is this
Mm.
haram? That wasn't the case. And so a lot of things that they were given a different interpretations, or they wouldn't like consider it as restrictive as unfortunately we are finding it
Yeah,
today amongst
that
Muslims,
is very true.
those who
Mm.
are pregnant. So that is the problem that is also emerging. What I've at times heard, you would say it is the folk version of
Mm.
Islam. Well, that folk version of Islam was more
Yeah,
pluralistic and encompassing of
absolutely,
differences,
absolutely.
and that happened because of these types of philosophical teachings and Sufi teachings that were part
Yeah,
of the society.
absolutely. So, how do you explain the type, like, let's say, um, um, Daniel Haqiqatju kind of type, Doctor, and it isn't about names, but I know you definitely don't want to get high, but I'm just giving an example to make it kind of concretize. You've got, educated, presumably reasonably affluent, I'm assuming, being from having been to Harvard, very well articulate, in that kind of structure of society where I'm assuming he's not just worrying about survival at a food level, um, but yet very concerned with these kind of issues all the time, that it dominates the discourse. And I see this, unfortunately, with several Western, American especially, Muslim imams who I otherwise find very chilled and relaxed. But I find that they seem to hate liberalism. And I don't, because liberalism in Europe means something different to America. But when you ask them what's the problem, because I just understand liberalism as less power to authoritarianism, to authorities, but the first thing they bring up is if the left are allowed gays. I mean, this is like the kind of pandemic fear that they have, that everybody's going to become gay, and I don't get it. I don't understand why this scare. And these people are, like you're saying, they're from affluent backgrounds, they're educated, they're in prestigious positions. They're not the kind of poor people.
Right. One thing I would mention, and again, I mean, like as you can see, I'm not going to engage in terms of
No, yeah. And I don't mean to,
yeah,
just to
right,
be
right,
clear for the
right,
public as well, and for
right,
yourself, Doctor. I don't mean to kind of drop names on you. I was just giving an example for the
right,
viewers, but you could keep it
right.
general, of course.
Right. So in general, what we do notice is that, and this is what we have to recognize, that when the fiqh books were written, they were very, right, wrong, right, wrong. And so this type of mentality has influenced a lot of people, even the educated one, because they're coming that frame of mind with that they're saying, what is the truth? And so they take a very empirical approach, you might say, not empirical approach, but they take an approach that's saying that this is one best way. The thing is that this is problematic, and they're not utilizing the other interpretations or the other dimensions of Islam. So they're very fiqh orientated, and they believe this is Islam. A lot of these people, when you would see those who come on this dawa scene, they don't mention Sufism. They're always talking about halal and haram in Bukhari and Muslim. The reason is that this is how they understand Islam to be. And if one takes this interpretation of Islam, then the ihsan component, as in the hadith of the Prophet of Islam, which is that you worship God as if you see Him, that is missing. And so I feel at a lot of times there is that, unfortunately, there's a lack of spiritual development that
But
is transpiring.
I want to add there, Doctor Sayed, if I could, please. You see, I understand that side. There's these people who are almost and I don't mean this in a way to say on people who suffer from things like autism, but I find this kind of religious autism that some people bring to this uber black and white, and everything must be a regimental. But I find from a lot of regular American kind of imams who I otherwise find quite like awesome, like even people who I love and respect, like let's say you have the Zaytuna Institute with most of its kind of imams, and you have other people who I find generally icons, but there is this kind of fear of the left and of liberalism, especially in America. And when you ask these people that what is it that you're afraid of, because here we understand liberal to mean the state has less authority over you, the first thing that they mention for being very kind of conservative, ultra conservative, is that they will promote. They say that if the left are left to it, they will promote LGBT values. And so I see this must be a kind of huge concern, even amongst non-Muslims, I'm assuming, in America. Is this something you've picked up on in your studies, or is this just something we see over here? Or I don't know.
I feel one of the reasons.
Yes, of
Can
course,
you hear me,
of
right?
course. Yeah.
Hello? Okay. So, what I feel one of the reasons might be is the effect of modernization itself. What do I mean by that? When modernization came, the idea was that there's one best way of doing everything. And the Muslim world was heavily influenced by the modernization process. That's why you started finding that, instead of recognizing multiplicity, they were always trying to find that one best way. And now, what has happened for a lot of Muslims is that they're saying that, okay, if we accept LGBT, where do we then, hold our grounds? They're afraid to recognize that religious interpretations are not immutable as is being argued. And they then feel that, okay, if there is nothing to hold on to, what will we know what is Islam? And so there is that also issue, I feel, because that is what I've heard as well. They would say, okay, where do we stop? But then that one has to be honest and ask, okay, this is a continuous community discourses and it's going to evolve.
Mm.
So I feel that is that, that level of, there's that
The
fear that what
the
would be
final
taken.
frontier.
Right.
it's
And
the
that's why I
it's the
said for the,
rectum,
and
unfortunately.
so what I would say is that that's why Sufism was also, it became a part of these communities. They didn't have issues that, because Sufism itself, the forms of different theories that came emerged, the Akbarian perspective, it takes a very deconstructive
Yeah.
position actually.
Mhm.
So,
No, I
so
was going
sorry,
to
go
say,
ahead. So yeah, that is to
yeah,
what about it?
do you first of all feel that the people in power, in Muslim circles especially, that's who I'm talking about, like imams, etc. They are very like they. Our impression is they don't like at all anything to do with liberal. Like they see this as an insult in America.
So the so we have to differentiate between the imams and the
Mm,
ordinary Muslims. Like the ordinary Muslims, they're okay with that. And that's why I said majority of American Muslims they're supporting. The imams, many of them are trained from where? Either from Salafia Institute or from Deobandi Institute. We know those who have studied in these madrasas, you can't even challenge certain the opinion of their teacher, let alone you can think
But
about these
even
things. So
like I
for
mentioned, like respectable and things very dear to me as well, I respect and love, like Zaytuna Institute. It's something which isn't like that. It's a very contemporary model, but yet they will very clearly make it. I mean, they will be very clear that we. It's not only we're not a part of that, but a disdain for liberalism and for the left.
right. So what is happening is, yes, that might be the case. As this is, you can see, but these are platforms whereby you will probably see after 20, 30 years, these institutes themselves are shaped, evolving into becoming more liberal in their
Mm,
approaches. Right now, this is the standard. But because they're giving space for discussions among their students, soon there is going to be difference of opinions that are emerging. We can see this as an example of Yaqeen Institute.
mm,
The articles they're writing, whether it's about the Kirat, whether it's about social attitudes, they're creating views which they themselves would say, oh, we're not holding this. But that they are presenting, that itself is something to be considered. Otherwise, 10 years back, these views could not even have been discussed. So, what happens is that while these institutes might hold these views, sooner or later they're going to be
mm,
challenged. And then there's going to be discourses happening. So, it's always that thesis,
mm.
antithesis,
The
it's
Hegelian
a
kind of, yeah,
type of, yeah,
dialectic.
exactly, right? That is how dialectic approach that would happen, and it would lead to
Wow.
something new. So no doubt what you're saying about Zaytuna is, or other institutes, that might be the case. But in time, because remember, like for example, there's in the past, no one would, like 20 years back, you would not see Muslim women being the main speaker in a gathering. Now Zaytuna are inviting Muslim women, those who are trained in Islamic studies, for
Yeah.
example. Why did this happen? Because they're facing a new situation. And of course, what would happen? They're going to justify it by going to the text, like Dr. Akram Nadawi wrote in his book Al-Muhaddis. He found this. Sooner, more liberal views are going to be coming, and then there would be a retroactive rationalization, that is to define
Mhm.
you know define these actions as being permissible in religion.
But stretching the parameters to include the non-Muslims as well in places like America, do you feel that that holds true though? That people they have a disdain for liberalism?
I cannot say about non-Muslims because that is not my
Okay,
focus of
okay,
research. So
okay,
unfortunately,
sure.
I cannot add any insight. If I would say anything, it will just be nonsense.
You mean like the stuff that I usually just say?
No, not at all, not at all. But it's just that that is not
Mm.
the focus of my research, so I
Because
cannot
that's
add
because
any
that's
insight that
interesting.
might be
Because when
valuable.
I, it's the impression I get, and I sometimes feel that, like, so for example, there isn't even when you look at their political parties, there isn't really a socialist party that kind of like here in the UK you have like Labour, which in essence is socialist. It's about like general welfare, and I suppose in Canada you do have general welfare though and stuff like, and you have like the health system and stuff. But I suppose it's still linked to the UK as well. uh, in some way. But yeah.
There's one point I might mention, and this is written in a book, I think Secularization and Sacred by Philip Norris. I have to check it. Yes, American non-Muslims also might hold really conservative views, and the reason compared to European,
Mm,
right? The reason might be is that American society has more income inequality compared to
mm.
European countries. So that might be a reason, but because it's not my part of research, so I'm sorry I cannot add any
You know,
valuable insight.
tying into affluence and economic
Mhm.
prosperity, do there has been several studies, and you're obviously very familiar with them with your background, to show that, look, as affluence grows and prosperity, economic prosperity, there is a decline. There's a kind of like a negative correlation between religious fervor and your kind of economic prosperity. Would you feel then that there is ultimately, as this booms higher and higher on this end, there is no space ultimately left for God?
So what is happening is that, and these are we're living in a post-modernist world, you can say, and we have also there are different factors like globalization and all that. So what is happening now with regards to religion? It is shifting from being an institutionalized to more individual. So now people do believe it's not that God has gone away, because there's this notion of secularization theory. This was the idea that the more secular society gets, the less religious
Mm.
people will become, but still we find people being religious. The reason is that the form of religiosity is changing. In the past, what would happen is that you would have institutionalized religions. That is not the case anymore. Because of globalization, what has happened is that knowledge has become a public domain. Knowledge is in the public level. Now, for example, I don't have to go to a mufti in a madrasa. I can simply Google, and to find my own view, I can even
Or you
type
can
there.
go to
So, for
YouTube Mufti
example,
Abu Layth's channel and just watch it there.
ex- exactly why this is halal according to Mufti Abu Layth. I
Yes,
just need to
and
fill in
my
that space,
default
right?
kind of premise is all things by default are halal.
Because the fuqaha themselves
Yeah,
said, the
exactly.
fuqahas, this is the qaida amongst them, that everything is permissible unless it is stated otherwise. This was the majority of
Yeah.
views, like you mentioned. So, having said that, what is happening is that God will be there, but the way we are assuming, and that is why people are now focusing more towards spirituality. Maybe that's the reason that people are also reading into Akbarian philosophy and Sadrian philosophy. Because what is happening is that many people are not finding that the notion that we go to the mosque and we'll
Mm.
find some peace, inner peace, to be the case. There are Muslims who are not attending mosque. There are Muslims, like, they don't go to the Jummah because they say in the Maliki school of thought, as mentioned in Ibn Rushd, one school of thought, one view within Maliki is that it is fardul kifaya. So as long as Mufti Abu Layth goes and pray, I'm done with that.
Damn.
So the notion is that
Then they've had it. If they're
right.
relying on
So,
me, this ship has long sunk.
so 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 you can see that God will be there, but the way we are defining the relation with the Creator, that is changing. That is why people are saying we're spiritual, that they're believing in something, but the notion of God as given in that institutionalized religion, that He's severe, He's going to punish for everything, that is where the fiqh orientation also comes. That is being
Because what
rejected.
I've seen is that there was, in the last maybe 2 decades, prior to these last few years, there was this huge pushback against religion and this very demonization of religion. You saw people insulting religion. Religion was ridiculed. It was dumb and stupid to believe in God. It was seen as very anti-scientific. It was seen as, backwards and Neanderthal-like, almost primitive. But I find in the last few years, there seems to have, now that atheism has kind of, there was this fervor to it in as it's kind of really, in the militant days of Dawkins and the militant days of Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and this whole, but as it's taken root and stabilized, as it's become like now it's there. It's a clear contender. It's not going anywhere now. They themselves, a lot of people have started to feel that void of what what you refer to as spirituality, or that connection with the transcendent, or the loss of community, or the loss of even like people. You see in some of the lectures, they will now say, that is true. That what do we do here? Because there seems, I would argue, it's an innate kind of a yearning that we have for something transcendent. And it's kind of brought them, in some ways, brought some people to saying, well, okay, what I'll do is I'll connect, but just not with any organized religion.
Right. So yeah, that is what is happening, this notion of void. And we also see this also in the approach that social science, for example, is taking. In its past, social science was very a positivistic discipline that is always looking at numbers and trending. But then there was the shift recognizing that, look, numbers, that is, its empirical approach is not enough. So they started to take this qualitative, whereby you're looking at this ethnographically, phenomenologically, and so forth, recognizing that the reality of an individual is based on his own understanding. So that's a Thomas theorem that says that you define reality as the way you're assuming it to be. So there was that loss, especially we're living in a world that having been modernized in such a way that we have lost that connection, community connection. In the past, you used to have community connection, for example. With the COVID situation, now you have jobs, people are working from home, so they're not even having interactions with their colleagues and all that. So human by itself is a social creature. And it requires, it thinks about, why am I here with this vast universe? What is a person like me doing here? So these are existential questions. That is why there was an article written by a scholar who said, so long as death remains, these existential questions will remain. Religion is not going anywhere. The forms would change, of
No,
course.
so true. And just a quick note before I want to come back to,
Yeah.
Where you're speaking about religion and you spoke about the plurality. And I know you've looked into and you've mentioned before Akbarism, this whole Akbari, Deen Akbari thing, philosophy. But
Yeah.
just before that, just on a tangential note with what you're saying, people are now more and more online, and the need for human interaction. I feel that without face-to-face interaction, it's incredible how devoid we become of compassion and empathy. We become very, you see, it's because it's just a name and a profile, and we just have to, like the amount of hate that is spewed online, on things like Twitter, on social media platforms, because it's just a person, it's just a name. Like it's not even like, even if there was a photo, but we can differentiate between the electronic thing and a real human. And I don't, obviously we can differentiate, but I mean we emotionally react differently. Yeah.
Right. Right. And I agree, because that human component is missing. But another reason is that I feel, even if we are meeting face to face, that level of respect or tolerance is still missing, because now we're looking at times human beings, we're looking at them as simply numbers. We have lost that idea that they're also part of us. And that's where, Akbarian philosophy would come. For example, the climate issue that we're having, climate crisis that are transpiring, we don't recognize that the nature around us is also part of our reality. We see it as a form of using it so that we can gain through it economic benefits.
Absolutely. I mentioned this just the other day, and it was on my Mufti's meetup, and obviously the person, we were kind of at disagreement, but I mentioned that the Quran says, وَجَعَلْنَا مِنَ الْمَاءِ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ حَيٍّ, that from a primordial source of origin, some water, some liquid, God created all life. Like we are ultimately all all forms of life are ultimately related. We are related with nature.
Related and
Yeah.
yes, and that is what the Sufi metaphysicians, this is what they were talking about. So the notion of wajud itself, like what is wajud, and the difference between wajud and mahiya. Mahiya is what is it?
Yeah.
Mahiya, what is it? And wajud is it? The reality is that for a lot of people, and that's why they were able to show more tolerance, is that they recognize that the other person also participates in this wujud.
Wow.
Now, one can say, oh, we don't have any proof for that, and this, that's fine. But I'm just simply showing the effects of that. Those acknowledge that, okay, the other person I disagree with, but because he's sharing this wujud, what is happening is that he's going to be more careful with the other person. Rather than seeing him as an enemy, you're seeing him that he's a different shade, different modality, different form of the wajud. So when you're
no,
talking,
carry on.
I just, yeah. So when you're talking about just the, this everything's come from this original primordial entity, the Sufis, they would say there's more to it, and they would say they would quote these verses. The Sufis, they would say, wheresoever you turn, there's the face of God. And they would also say that, there's the ayat in Surah Al-Fussilat. It says that we will soon show our signs within the horizons and in themselves until they know that it is the truth. The word who refers to both, as in both the cosmos and also to the individual self. And God in the Quran says that who al-haq,
حتى
he is the truth.
يتبين له أنه الحق.
Yes.
Subhanallah.
Right?
Wow. I
And it
never
also,
really thought of that. Wow, that is amazing. I never thought of
so
it like that before. Yeah.
yeah. So the Quran then also says that what? Zalika annahu huwal
What
haq, that
you're
he is
saying
the
here,
truth.
just for the viewers, that Allah says, وَسَنُرِيهِمْ آيَاتِنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ, that we will show them the signs in the horizon.
Soon we will show.
And
Soon.
I've said
Right.
this meant in the cosmos, and then bringing it back to the quantum or in themselves. But going on, the verse following on to say, حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنْ, until it becomes manifest and clear, lahu, to him.
No, annahu,
حَتَّى
I think it is,
يَتَبَيَّنَ
brother.
لَهُ أَنَّهُ. Then after that, it's until it becomes clear to him that it is the truth, or that he is the haq. This is what you're saying.
Right. So the who refers to both the
Wahdatul wujud.
cosmos and yes. Now this is what the scholars would say, that the annahu, because the who can
Wow.
be for both the cosmos and all that, and at the end who is the truth. So now what happens is that if a person takes this way, even in the bad things that he's seeing, he finds goodness. Because what he's saying, oh, this is all different forms of wajud. They have different
And
gradations
this
of wajud.
annahul haq, this is the origin or the etiology. This is the birth, the genesis of anil haq. Is this
this is
the
then it would be
manifestation?
related to, because here's another thing that we then have to recognize, that when we say that, and then by the verse after that, it's continued, it says, is it not sufficient that your God is witness over everything? So it extends that. Now, with having said that, why would the scholars take this view? Because they know one of the attributes of God, and I'm talking this from a Sufi perspective, right? They would say that God is the truth. So the Shahada we recite, La ilaha illallah. If you remove the ilah and you put in haq, so what it means is that there is no truth except the ultimate truth. There is no truth except God. So then they say, okay, we see everything around us. So there is that notion of it is He, but then also laysa kamislihi shayun. There is nothing like Him. So that is why Ibn Arabi would say, look with the two eyes. There is the tanzi component, it is not He. But then there is also He, it is He. So in everything that you see, this is what happens. Because we as human beings are made of, we have two forms, or not two forms, we have two things in us, the non-existence, but then the wujud that came. And doesn't it say in Bukhari, I believe, that God created Adam in his form? Surah.
I mean, it is a hadith, obviously critiqued by some, but yes, that God created Adam in his form. Yeah.
So the Sufis would say that this is what it means, that we can understand this. And of course, there's another, in the Quran it says that God blew his spirit into Adam. So what happens is that there's a recognition that everything at the end is wujud. So, but at the same time, they recognize that human beings have limited capacity. So my vantage or my point of view is true, but it can also be challenged by another point of view. Because the ultimate truth only lies with the divine. And the divine can only know itself because we cannot know. Because laysa kamithlihi shay'un. There's nothing like him. So the more we know him, We are getting to know him, but we cannot completely know him.
In this view of wahdatul wujud, just coming to understand this is heavily put forward by Sheikh Ibn Arabi, Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi, and the whole, it's very, very controversial topic that is known. This, that everything in essence, because what it's not saying that, in a way, it's not saying that, oh, well, this is God, this phone, or because this is how it's criticized, isn't it? That the Salafis say, well, if God is everything, then when I eat this apple, I ate God. That's a very kind of a dumb critique of it, isn't it? I mean, what if you briefly or just in some words break it down? What is wahdatul wujud?
Interestingly, Ibn Arabi never used Wahdat al-Wujud. It was his student who used it for the first time, but yes, we do find the concept of Wahdat al-Wujud in the works of Ibn Arabi. Now, here's one interesting thing. Why is it that Ibn Arabi became such a prominent scholar that people would follow in the pre-modern world, from the Balkan to the Bengal region? There must be something to his works. Now, when he's talking about Wahdat al-Wujud, he sees different levels of hierarchy. The reality, the essence, the Zat. The Zat is something that cannot be defined. It is unknowable, ineffable. Laysa kamislihi shay'un. But the whole cosmos comes through his names. It is through his names that the different formations of reality are coming into existence. So all of these things that they become an ishara referring to his divine names. So when we see something, for example, we see something that, a judge, what do we recognize? He's providing justice. God is God is a judge. When we look at a mother, the mercy that she's showing to the son, what is she reflecting? The mercy of God. So the divine names are being shown through this way, and these divine names are coming from that ultimate reality that cannot be known. Because the thing is that if you try to define the ultimate reality, you're restricting it.
Yeah. So but at an ontological level, is when it expresses that everything is in essence every being is in essence a part of, is just the being, which is God. How does that tally? Does that tally in two ways? Is that in the sense that God is through everything, he permeates everything, or is it in the sense that we simply exist in the imagination of God? Are we in the way an author conjures characters and has a story? Are we simply in part of this story that is in the mind of God? Not imagination, but the mind of God. Sorry.
Yeah. So our archetypes were in the mind of God, one can say, and that's why Mirza Ghalib, he said, when it was shairi that I read, Dubaya mujhko mere hone ne na hota mein to kya hota. He was sad that now he has been given existence, so he has been separated. But the Sufis would say you have to be separated because to actualize divine love, there has to be firaq, there has to be separation. Only through separation can there be visal. So when God said kun, that was the separation. And it is this journey, because now what is happening is that the separation has made the loved and the beloved longing, the beloved, in this case the creation, longing for its lover.
In the words of Mir, where he says, Dikhai diye yun ke bekhud kiya, that hame aap se hi juda kar chale. And here aap, they say, could be translated, one of the amazing aspects of it, it could mean aap se juda kar chale, and ya aap se, yani aap se juda kar chale, from myself, you've kind of torn me in pieces. But I see.
So that is why there's separation. Otherwise, you can't experience that divine love. At the same time, it makes sense that, why are there so much diversity? Because take an example. Look, when we say everything is wajud, it doesn't mean everything has equal degree of wajud.
So it's not just in the mind of God.
No, it is that the mind of God had it, and then we came through this existentiation that we were given existence. Why were we given existence? The Sufis would say so that we could recognize, so that we could experience this joy of what existence is, because our reality was what? Non-existence. Non-existence is connected with darkness. It is connected with separation from the good. So we wanted that. And so, as a blessing, it was given to us. And that is why then the Sufis would say, Maliki Yawmiddin, connecting deen with dain, that this is a loan given to us. The existence is given from God. And the reason, and therefore, he would ask us, what did we do with it?
Wow. I see.
So now, having said that, we also have to recognize that there are degrees of gradations. हम उर्दू में कहते हैं नहीं, देखो वो बुजुर्ग कितने नूरानी लग गए हैं. And when we see a politician, we say, "Wow, look at that politician." पता लग रहा है, right?
Absolutely.
So right? When we say a person is nurani, the Sufis would say we have to recognize this tashkikul wajud, these gradations of degrees.
Of being,
So what
of
does
reality.
of being, of reality, because God is Nurul Samawati wal Ard. So the closer you are to the divine, you're going to get more light. So it is like the example, you are in a room. Let's say your lamp, the room's bulb is on the right side. Whatever is closer to that right, first of all, if it's closed, there's complete darkness. If you turn on the light, the furniture that is closest to that light would have the most intensity, and the door is the furthest away from that bulb, so it wouldn't have that much intensity. So this is the example given to recognize that one who gets closer to the divine, they will find more intensity in them. And in fact, what did the prophet do dua for? God, make me a light. Allahumma jalni noora.
Yeah, subhanallah.
Make the front.
بين يدي نورا وخلفي نورا وعلى يميني نورا وعلى
Exactly.
شمائلي نورا. It's a beautiful dua.
Exactly. So why be, and there's a, and doesn't it say also in a hadith, and the Sufis they quote a lot, that when Allah loves someone, he becomes his eye, his sight, his hearing, the hand with which he strikes. So what is now happening is that the person is getting closer to the divine. And so he is acquiring the beautiful attributes of what? Justice, treating nicely, and so forth. So what happened is that the Sufism became a form of ethical discourse within the community. The Sufis would say, if the more you get closer to Allah, the more these rahma attributes of his you would show, because God has two main components, the jalal and the jamal. And God is beautiful and he loves beauty. So as you can see, that the example I gave you in the room, the further away you are from the source of that light, the more darkness a person would have. So this is the idea given, that if a person goes away from the divine light, the further they become trapped in this darkness. And the darkness means they don't have any feeling of goodness. Now, of course, people can criticize it from an empirical sociological perspective, but this is one discourse that has always existed in the Muslim world, in the pre-modern Muslim world. I'm talking about the medieval time. Yet this is missing in the present contemporary Muslim
Was this
society.
what I mean? You mentioned the Akbarian kind of philosophy. Was this his goal and objective? What he was trying to set out?
Yeah. Sorry, what do you mean by goal
of
and
Akbar?
objective? Like
of Akbar in his because the Akbari, Deen Akbari is the general.
That's a different Deen. Sorry, Deen Akbari was for the Akbar.
Yeah. So
Mughal.
was that
So
not what you
it
referred to earlier when you said?
No, I'm referring to Ibn Arabi. His philosophy is known as Akbarian philosophy.
Sorry. Earlier on, when you mentioned Akbarian, and I thought you meant because of pluralism, I thought you meant Akbar, the Mughal king.
No.
Okay, right. Okay.
His philosophy is known as Akbarian philosophy. Now, his goal was what? His goal was to make a person al-insan al-kamil. The insan al-kamil is the perfect human being who becomes you can say, the connection between the divine and the creation. Within him, he finds the divine attributes. And that is why he would then say that God created Adam in his image. And there's a hadith, al-mu'min maratul mu'min, right? Yeah. So one of the attributes of God is al-mu'min as well.
Right. Whoa. So they're saying mir'atullah. So now they're saying,
yes. So now you should become the mirror of the al-mu'min, the divine.
Right.
So that he sees himself through you. That is the
that is. I see that it's amazing. Whoa, there's two interpretations that have today just blown my mind. I've never. One was what you mentioned about annahul haq. I'd never come across that before. And this al-mu'min mir'atul mu'min, obviously a hadith very well known, but is a reflection of the divine. Wow. Okay, that is it is yeah.
That's why it, yeah, that's why Ibn Arabi said that, a person of faith, whenever he reads the Quran, he will find multiple, all the time he'll find new interpretation. And in the Quran it says, where the trees, the pens, where the trees, the kalam, and the ocean upon seven oceans, the ink, the words of God cannot be extinguished. Because if we recognize that words of God, that is the Quran, then in the Muslim philosophy, God is infinite.
Yeah.
That cannot be defined. So therefore, how can his words be constricted? And that's why Ibn Arabi was so comfortable with accepting that there are going to be pluralistic, multiple interpretations.
I understand. Yeah.
Because he,
Because
yeah.
I have come across Muhyiddin ibn Arabi on the verse of the Quran where he says that إنما إلهكم إله واحد, where he says that this means that the verse means that indeed your Lord is one God. Now, his interpretation was that this verse was being addressed to people generically, as in including the kuffar, and not just to Muslims, but saying ultimately, no matter what you're worshipping, he was trying to say you're ultimately worshipping God.
Yes, if I may add to that, the Quran says God has decreed that you worship one God, the
Yeah.
ayat that you're saying, He has decreed. Now, the reality is that even the Muslims are worshiping God with their understanding of God. Is that not creating in the mind a form of God? So Ibn Arabi would say, you have taken one form of the understanding of God. It is true. The Mu'tazilites, they're taking the Tanzi approach. Someone is taking a more Tasbih approach. So that is why he is saying, whatever you do, no matter whatever you do, that at the end of the day, these are manifestation, tajalli of the divine. Even and wajud is what? It's not wajud is not something that is just outside of your eyes, outside of your body. The thoughts you're creating, these are mental forms of wajud. The doubts you're having, these are doubts of that are formed based on wajud. So what is now happening is that if a Muslim prays to God, he has a general notion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Ibn Arabi would say, this is a form you have given to God. So what is this not the same thing what another person is doing, except that person has given a corporeal image of God? So what he's trying to say is that no matter what, and that's why he became so controversial, is that people don't understand what he's trying to say. He is saying that whatever you think of God, you're limiting him. And yet, remember, laysa kamislihi
Yeah.
shay'un. There's nothing like him.
The question here is, though, that with this understanding, with the Allah, and tying into, look, the creator of the great majestic cosmos, with everything, and right down to the quantum, Allah has, with just mesmerizing perfection for it to exist. Now, why, one would question here, why would a God so magnanimous, amazing, and in his splendor, why would he be trying to threaten people and set Muslims against other people and saying, look, jahidil kuffara wal munaf, and do this and do that, and when when ultimately everything, all of being, is contingent upon his being. So what difference does it
Right.
make? I mean, we are just, we're just not even ants in his
Right.
world.
Right. So, yeah, these are some questions that do come up with, once we recognize this form. But then the Muslim scholars, they would, it's not an easy question when
Yeah.
you're talking about this, like, okay, why are these coming? But they would say, at least when it comes to the issues of, and I can speak from a
Mm.
salvific perspective, is that these are threats that, for example, are made so that just like a parent might say, if you
Yeah.
don't do this, you will be
It's
grounded.
it's
But
part
no
of a
parent would,
discourse, a kind of a
it's a
narrative.
part of a,
Yeah.
exactly, a narrative, a
Mm.
discourse. And so this is that has to be considered. At the same time, we have to recognize that the divine names themselves have a conflict amongst them. So God is revealing himself in manifest form through these divine names. So you have the Jamal and the Jalal attributes. And so there will always going to be these forms of differentiations that are going to be happening. And this you can see in the manifested world. Now, does it give a clear answer? No, there can be more concerns raised to that. But this is how the Muslim
because
scholars would, the
because
Sufis would perhaps
I
take their
in the past,
interpretation.
when I've been asked this as well, have kind of said that my understanding is that, you see, just as in nature, for things to permeate and to survive and thrive, that they require a kind of they require an antagonistic reaction
Right,
for it to kind of, like we mentioned, the Hegelian kind of dialectic. Things don't just,
right,
even in nature, just go like this. There is an antagonism, and then there is a kind of reaction and an antagonism and a stimulus.
right.
And in a similar way, these discourses have been created, that, there will be these adyan, and Muslims have been told to go forth and do this, and this is the narrative for it to kind of spread out the way it did. A competition.
So that yeah, this can be taken as an approach as well. That, as you've mentioned, that to construct something, there's always going to be coming difference of two groups are going to come. They're going to have differences, and then they construct together. Clearly, we are seeing this in this postmodern world. Sorry, we're seeing this in this postmodernistic world, that basically how people are coming together, they're coming to something that is greater than them, that is something beyond them. So yes, that may be the case, but then someone can argue, why even have these
Yeah,
conflicts? At the end of the day, we have to recognize that this is the divine
yeah,
theater in which the divine is manifesting himself. This is how the Sufis say, and that we are fortunate to experience that. And the reason we go through these difficulties is to experience knowledge, experience divine in its full gloriness, in its full radiance. Because if we just felt goodness, we wouldn't know what bad is. And once we know what bad is, we appreciate what good is, but now we have a complete form of knowledge. So it is making us closer to understand what the divine is. Because the divine cannot be restricted to any thought. Because again, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ
no,
شَيْءٌ.
that is, yeah. I mean, it's very well said there, Sayed. And I agree with you. These are very sometimes challenging kind of questions people put up. It's not easy, but I think that's a tremendous answer to it. Do you feel that consciousness? Because I translate often the ruh as consciousness. I don't know what your thoughts are
Right.
on this, and does consciousness
Yeah.
ultimately, at some level, whether I've said maybe it ties into some kind of a stream. Maybe it's connected, then some stream, then maybe it has some connect ultimately with the divine.
All right.
Do-
That that's a really good question. And here's the thing: why, we were talking previously. I said it is important for Muslims to learn about Islamic philosophy, because they have focused on these issues: consciousness, self-knowledge. When I'm now, let's look at Mullah Sadra. Mullah Sadra, one of the great scholars. He was in terms of fiqh, he was from Isna Ashari, but in terms of Sufism, he accepted Ibn Arabi, he accepted Sarwardi, and he accepted
Wait, Mullah
what's his
Sadra
name?
wasn't
Sorry.
Hanafi?
No, and what is interesting in Dars Nizam, they
Yeah,
teach
I
Mullah
I
Sadra,
thought it was
and yet he was.
Hanafi. No,
No, no, see, that is the interesting thing. Now, can
because
you see?
Deobandis quote him all the time,
Yeah,
and they
right.
hate
And this is just the
Shia.
thing. Yeah. That is why I said that, when I said about the madrasa, they don't teach you research, they don't teach you how to go into knowledge, is because they have this frame structure, and that they would say follow this. Mullah Sadra, rahimullah, was a Isna Ashari
Wow.
scholar who was significantly influenced by Ibn Arabi, Sarwardi, and Ibn Sina, for example. So uh, now the issue of consciousness. Look, the problem is that, and this was the issue they had, like, okay, how can I know the laptop that is in front of me is exactly what it is? What if there's this epistemic gap? If there's a gap in
Mhm.
epistemology, right? So then they came up with this issue of al-ittihad bainul akil wal ma'kul, that there's a unification that transpires between the knower and the known, which is true. It happens through your self knowledge. So one of the books that I've been reading, I read it once, I'm reading it again within a group reading session, is written by Dr. Ibrahim Kalin, who is a student of Dr. Syed Hussein Nasser, and he has written the book Knowledge in Later Islamic Philosophy. With regards to these questions, I would suggest you should read this book and also Dr. Syed Hussein Nasser's work. He's a brilliant scholar. He was trained in traditional philosophy by people like Alama Tabatabai. Um, so Sheikh Hamza Yusuf also recommends him. So you can see he has a really, he's a very knowledgeable man. So now the thing is that here's one thing. This is how the Muslims start. You can doubt everything, but you cannot doubt your own existence. So you have that self knowledge.
That's Cartesian, isn't it? Descartes.
The Cartesian has that issue that he bifurcated the quality and the quantities of the things. So there was the res externa and interna. So that's the reason that it didn't go that forward. But before him came Ibn Sina, where he spoke about the
Yeah.
hanging man. Ibn Sina said that if you remove the limbs of everything, still a person would be conscious of himself. So the thing is that whatever you have doubts, you cannot doubt your own existence. If you doubt your own existence, you're certain that you're doubting. So there's always that element of certainty,
Yeah, absolutely. Cogito ergo sum. That's it.
right? So now you have that level of certainty. What is interesting, Mufti Saab, you are listening to me, but this knowledge is being transmediated. It's being mediated by your self knowledge. Yourself cannot accept anything except itself. Yourself, the knowledge of yourself cannot accept anything except itself. That you're able to take that information that is coming outside of you from me and make it part of yourself means there's an isomorphic
Wow.
relationship. What is
Isomorphic.
happening?
Wow.
Morphic, yeah. Iso means same and morphic means form, right? So there's something, and that's where this whole notion of wahdatul wujud also comes, that there's something similar because only the like can know the like. That I'm speaking to you, it's you're able to listen to it, but it is being mediated by your knowledge of yourself. So it is penetrating, it is entering yourself.
It's kind of
This
being
whole notion
subsumed into me as part of my knowledge.
subsumed, and yes, and right, what is happening, you'll see your intellect is increasing. It is increasing, and that is what happens, that there's another form of reality. This is how the Sufis would say, or the metaphysicians would say. Now that this has happened, at the end of the day, all of it goes back to that divine conscious. All of that goes back to that ultimate reality. Because why? Because yourself cannot be created from any other thing except itself. It cannot be anything except itself. So the principle of yourself has to be the divine self.
Oh, wait, just break
So
that. Whoa, that's so. Right, that part again. Yeah. So we're coming to the self is the kind of primordial, the ultimate building block that we reach.
It is the ocean. It is the ocean without the shore. It is the ocean without the shore. Right?
Yeah.
More you think about yourself, you'll find that yes, you don't have any limitation. Now we know the self cannot be anything except itself.
Yeah.
Okay, it can. So where did that self come from? It has to come from that principal self, and that is what is wajib al-wujud.
This is where Allah breathed into Adam
Yes.
min ruhina.
Yes, yes. And therefore, wajib al-wujud is what? It does not depend on anything. It is necessary in itself. Wajib al-wujud. So that is how also through one's consciousness, one is then able to understand what the divine consciousness is. And that is why, though people know this is a hadith that is not sahih, but it can be found through Quranic principles, as the Quran says that those who forget themselves, God forgets them. So what is
the opposite?
That one who
Man
knows
arafa
himself,
nafsahu arafa rabbah.
Sorry. Yeah, exactly. So one who knows himself knows his Lord.
Wow, that is incredibly profound. That is incredibly profound, I have to say. Wow, this you know what? This discussion needs to be had on mushrooms. Wow, I mean, that's an interesting topic. That the Sufi saints of the past or other mystics, they had this kind of this relationship to some extent with psychedelics and things like this. I'm not sure if your research has extended into areas like that.
I haven't looked into that. There might have been, but these scholars like Ibn Arabi and all that, they were not like these, as far as I know, based on their history, what I've read. In fact, Ibn Arabi, what is interesting, Ibn Arabi was actually also a muhaddis and a faqih.
Yeah,
The reality is that he studied with 70 shuyukh, he studied Muslim,
yeah.
Bukhari, and by the way, just to make it more interesting, he was of the view that a woman can lead men in prayers
Yeah.
as well.
You see, he was in fiqh zahiri,
No, interesting. People argue that, but he considered himself as a
mujtahid.
mujtahid.
Ah, right. Okay.
Right?
Wow. That makes more
So,
sense, to be fair. That does,
yeah,
yeah.
he did not restrict himself to any school of thought because he recognized that the truth cannot be limited.
The more as with time passing by, dare I say, the more I age, but with time passing by, I've grown an increasing fondness to Ibn Arabi, Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi. Obviously, the Maliki one I've always been fond of, but this for a different perspective. And I've started to find this whole realm so just overwhelming. This thing of consciousness, and I feel that it's kind of left in a lurking in a corner in the general Islamic discourse.
Because the Muslims are feared because they consider him, he was known as a Sheikh al Akbar. Unfortunately, his critics among the more literalists called him a Sheikh al Akfar. This is a
That
tragedy.
means the most disbelieving Akfar.
Right.
Why did they used to call him the red sulfur thing, the Kibrit al Ahmar thing, that
Ah,
search for the red sulfur?
I there I can't recall exactly. There's actually a book on
Yeah,
written
yeah, yeah.
using that
There
name,
is. Yeah,
Red
yeah.
Sulfur. I'm sorry,
I read
I'm sorry,
something
I
as
can't
well
remember.
years ago. I
Yeah,
can't recall it now.
skips it.
There was
Yeah,
something about that it's like the hot stuff or something, and that they used to call
yeah,
red
yeah.
sulfur
I'm
the hot.
sorry. Yeah, I can't recall. But one book I would recommend about Ibn Arabi is The Sufi Path of Knowledge by Dr. William Shirik. He's another student of Dr. Sayyid Hussein Nasr. Oh, by the way, Dr. Sayyid Hussein Nasr, all of these, there are those who were criticized because they edited, they came up with the study
Yes, yes,
Quran,
yes. There was this because they said
right?
he influenced or was part of the editorial team. I don't know whether he was directly.
Right. Oh, no, no, it came through. Actually, it
Oh, it
was
was
him, the
okay.
Harper Collins. Yeah. So he came and his students, all of them are part of, all of them are his students, are close students, right? The reality is that this community, that is the community of Dr. Sayyid Hussain Nasr and them and his students, they're the most intellectual people that one
Yeah,
can find. One of the most intellectual people one finds in the Muslim
absolutely.
community,
Yeah.
because they are the people who have looked at Ibn Arabi, Mullah Sadr, and all that. So what is interesting is that one thing about Ibn Arabi, he wasn't like a person who didn't know about hadith or fiqh. He was quite acquainted with hadith sciences as well. He has names. He has both women and men as teachers.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. No, that's a very important point because people might assume that, oh, this airy fairy talk coming from, he's some guy who's just hangs about, maybe certain kind of, you get these mausoleums and you get these kind of dervish kind of people. This understanding is not clued up about the Sharia or fiqh, but he was a great scholar from a fiqhi, Shara'i kind of nususi perspective. That's very good to clear. Yeah.
So another thing is that the difference between the pre-modern Muslim world in terms of knowledge is also that there was an understanding that there is ilmul aqli and naqli. There was
Yeah.
both emphasis of aqli and naqli. That is the intellectual and the transmitted. Unfortunately, in the modern Muslim world, those who want to study Islam, they are more, and I'm talking about the Sunni world. In the Shia world, you still find that the aqli form of knowledge, that is the intellectual sciences are being spread. In the Sunni world, all you have is the most of it is focused on the naqli, transmission, transmitted. But the thing is that a lot of narrations, like I said, al Mu'min, Marat al Mu'min, and we also know there's a narration that the Prophet was a person who spoke few words, yet he was his meanings,
Mm.
they were vast, they were
Yeah.
expensive. They had more than one saying. There's a narration
Absolutely.
related
They
to
said
that,
that he'd been
right?
given an Jawami al Kalim. That would, yeah,
Yes.
with brevity
So
of speech, that means like using just short words, but the meanings have, they have exponential kind of expanse to them. Yeah.
Exactly. So how can then one just assume one interpretation of the
Mm.
Prophet? Thus, when we say al-mu'min maratul mu'min, there has to be another level
SubhanAllah.
of interpretation.
Wow, that is profound. I mean, putting Sheikh Ibn Arabi aside, but this whole talk of consciousness, of this kind of stuff, this I meant is left lurking in a corner. It's not part of the Islamic discourse today. Why is that?
Because what has happened is that we have been influenced. The modern Muslim world came after the colonization ended, and so they were heavily influenced by this notion of science and technology. So with all this notion of consciousness, it's not
Mm,
empirical. Sufism, not empirical.
mm,
There was a rejection. Now, what has happened in the West is that they have recognized the limitations of this positivistic approach, this quantitative approach. That is why they're moving towards qualitative. They're moving towards, like in social sciences, ethnographic studies or phenomenological studies. So now is being incorporated Sufi studies as well. And that's why they're appreciating that. Because, see, the problem is, yes, we might have rational mind, but then someone can question what are the limitations of the rational mind. Like, for example, I'm looking at the data, and based on the data, I'm creating trends. How did that perception of general trends come into my mind? These are the questions people started looking. Some are looking at from a some are looking from a neurological
neuroscientific.
perspective, yeah,
Yeah.
neuroscientific perspective, but some feel no, we should look at this
Mm.
perspective as well. And that is why you're seeing that a lot of scholars, non-Muslims, they're working on these topics. But in the Muslim world, we're still, in that stage whereby we're thinking that empirical approach is the way. And that is why, when you asked me in the beginning, not many people are taking sociological studies. Why? Because the emphasis has always been on what? Engineering, doctor, Yazadas is other more, at least now that is happening, is computer science and
Yeah.
MBA. Because this idea is that we take this one route, this empirical route, that is the way. And it has affected the whole thinking, unfortunately.
Mm.
I mean, take the issue of Kirat as well. This notion, it has to be like, this is what it is. To be honest, if one looks into the Kirat, they'll find also differences in the past. Imam at-Tabari, a
Yeah.
lot of, he didn't agree with
Of
certain
course,
Kirat.
of course, yeah.
It's a reality,
I
it's
had
a fact.
actually, in my
If we can,
response, I had said that the Quran, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but I had said that there was an inherent dynamism in the Quran, that it was meant to have this facility where people who were receiving it could substitute certain things if it created ease for them. Uh, yeah.
there Yeah, I mean, so we have in narration Kitab al-Asar, and there was an article written by Yaqeen. Abdullah bin Masud, who was amongst the Qurra, amongst the Sahabi, if an Ajami, a non-Arab, would come and he couldn't recite, he would give another similar meaning and say, "Can you not recite?" Now, of course, one can say that perhaps this another word, synonym, this other word that can be exchanged, perhaps it can be, if the Prophet had given. That might be the case. But what I find is more interesting is that the early people were more flexible in their diverse views, more
Yeah.
accepting than what is happening in today's world. They recognize the
Yeah.
differences. And this is a fact. The companions differed. Sometimes I quote about, prayer issue. Unfortunately, this is such a big issue in the subcontinent world, how to pray. Interestingly, Musannif ibn Abi
It's like 1400 years later, still
yes,
fighting over
yes,
how do you pray.
yes. So I quote this as an example, Musannif ibn Bishayba, volume 3. Umar, and this is a same narration because either it's Al-Qama or Aswad who has narrated that. He said that Umar, when he used to pray, he used to do Rafadan only once, like the Hanafis do. His son Ibn Umar, radiallahu anhuma, what does he do? He continuously does Rafadan. We both know, as for the
Who,
Sunni
sorry, who
historical, now I'm
continues
see,
to do
I'm
Rafal, you think?
Ibn Umar.
Ibn Umar.
Ibn
Yeah.
Umar used to, right? But Umar,
Mhm.
his father, the second caliph, he wouldn't do
Yeah.
it. Now, the point is that if we take a Muslim interpretation, if we assume all these narrations are Sahih, I'm not taking sociological at this case. I'm just trying to explain from a Muslim perspective in that way then. Well, here's the issue. Umar is a Sahabi, his son is a Sahabi, how is it possible that they differ in their prayers? The reason is probably they were taught different ways because the Sunni interpretation is that both were companions close to the Prophet. Not just that, Abdullah ibn Zubair, whose father is Zubair, whose grandfather is Abu
Yeah.
Bakr from the
Exactly.
maternal side, he used to do sadal,
Mm.
irsal,
Yeah.
like the Malik. Now, can you
Sadal
imagine
is
if he did it
holding your
wrong?
arms by the side as you pray.
Yeah. Now if he didn't know how to pray, wouldn't his father, grandfather say what type of prayers you're doing?
Now, it's
So
fascinating that you
yeah,
have something so um, so in your face like the prayer, which is so ubiquitous, it's everywhere, it's 5 times a day, and yet there isn't arguably a single clear, unquestionable Sahih hadith on where to place the hands.
right. The reason the reason is that it seems, and this is one of the things we have to see within Islam from the beginning, diversity was
Yeah,
accepted. I'll give you another narration. When the time there was a person who came and he asked the Prophet as to the times of prayers. Now you know that when it comes to Asr, there is ikhtilaf, the mislain and the misl, the shadow, right? So this companion who comes, the Prophet one day taught him to pray Asr when the shadow is equal to one's length. And then the next time when the shadow is equal to two length as in the person's height. So if it's twice the height. And then it was told that the prayers in between that. And remember, we didn't have watches
yeah.
in those times. We didn't have ghadiya. So what it happens is that there was a diversity that was always
Yeah.
acknowledged from the
I
earliest time.
felt that in early Islam, the Salaf period, there is a much greater uh, security of faith that the Muslims carry than later Muslims, because it's a sign of insecurity that you have to stamp certain things out. Because people who are confident, they usually, like, they might say something, it's like Imam Malik when he's asked that the Sunnah and what the way of the Prophet, and he says that, should we instruct somebody to do the Sunnah? And he says, no, he says yukhbar anha wa yutrak. Like, you just tell the person this is it, and you don't need to stamp your authority on someone. This sense of confidence that they had, yeah, it's
Yeah, exactly. And at the same time, they didn't have issues with
yeah,
diversity. This is what I feel. At the same time, it seems like, yes, they were living in a patriarchal society, the early Muslim period. But still within that, you do find that there are things they're doing that even now we find it problematic. For example, Umar made a woman inspector of the
yeah,
market. This is a Sahih narration, according to Sheikh Albani, who considers it as Jayyid or Hasan. I might be mistaken, but this is what it is. Now imagine today a lot of clerics, they're saying women should stay in their homes. There's a new form that unfortunately is emerging among the conservative clerics, is that they don't even want their wives or their female relatives to that their names should be known.
mm,
Yet we know the names of the prophet's wives.
exactly, exactly. And the Quran leading by example with Maryam.
Right.
Yeah, yeah,
Exactly.
wow,
So so we have to recognize there's so much into it, and it's interesting, like how they, for when it comes to women rights, unfortunately there are many, we have this patriarchal approach where we are restricting their rights. This is very
yeah,
unfortunate.
that is, absolutely. Wow, wow, Doc, it's been amazing. It's wow, and I know you've had a very long day as it is today, and we've taken so much of your precious time. But I really have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. It's been amazing. There's been just so much enlightenment just for me, and I'm sure the viewers feel the same. Is if people, I know some people had been mentioning in the comments as well about if somebody wanted to reach out with you to you, if they want to connect, what is the best platform to do so? And secondly, are you involved in any local teaching or teaching online?
So I just created the Skype ID for you so you can share that with them,
All right. What
right?
about generally social
So
media?
the
Are you on?
no, no, I don't like social media. Too
All
much
right.
issues. Like always, everyone is just
Too many
arguing with
too
each
many
other. I mean,
exes
why do
chasing
we?
after you.
Yeah. Why no? Why are there too many polemical discussions happening? It's really tragedy. People are dying, suffering, and we are arguing because we're living in privileged societies. We can right now discuss and then go eat burger and then condemn and say he's a kafir and all that. Look, by essence, everyone is good. Let's come to a dialogue. Let's sit together. Even those who make fun of Islam, talk.
Mm,
If you want to win over people, show your
yeah.
character. in Islam, the emphasis has always been on character building. Sure, if they criticize Islam, okay, that is fine. They're criticizing interpretation of Islam because we don't know what Islam is, because it is how we are shaping it to be. But let us come to, let's sit together and let's not argue. And unfortunately, this is becoming a business now amongst a lot of those who are communicating Islam by condemning, criticizing others. That's not healthy.
Absolutely.
That's not the ways of the
Oh,
Salaf.
absolutely, absolutely, Sayyid. I couldn't agree more. I mean, it is character that أحسن إلى الناس تستعبد قلوبهم فلطالما استعبد الإنسان إحسانه. That it is through character that we captivate the hearts of people. It is not, and this is why I say exactly the same thing. If people want to criticize Islam, I have no problem. I say criticize it. Let us see the best of the arguments that you have. For those who are seeking legitimate answers, inshallah, we will answer it, or somebody will rise to it and answer it. I have, in my experience, never seen personally Islam to ever not rise to the challenge.
Right. And another thing we need to recognize is that because we are, we have that non-existence given us existence, so we are in that stage that we cannot know everything. In other words, we need to be humble and recognize, yeah, this is my opinion, but I might be mistaken. Just like the scholars in the past would say, like, this is my opinion of being, probably it is right, but your opinion, it may be wrong, but probably it can also be correct.
I so agree with what you're saying, Said, and I often, I just want to say there, people who, in fact, there's been whole videos dedicated to me about this by people who hate me, unfortunately, that I often try to respond to questions by saying, look, I feel that this is what this is. In my understanding, this is what the ruling is. And people have, they've taken out so many cutouts of me, and I'm doing this in the, I've seen the clips, people have sent them to me, and where they say, hey, check out, this guy, and I'm being asked a question, and I say, well, I feel, or in my understanding, or I believe, or not often in my understanding, or I feel, and they're showing that on like 20 different times. I'm saying that, and they're saying, what a joke. Who gives a hell what who gives a damn what you think or what you feel? Tell us what the Quran or Sunnah says.
Right. Yeah. And the thing is, the Quran, Sunnah, the moment you pick any book, it's not just the Quran, Sunnah, pick any book, you're going to give your own interpretation.
And this is why I do this, because I am being transparent that, look, yes, I'm reading that verse of the Quran. In my understanding, this is what it's demonstrating. You see, none of us have access to the mind of God. We don't know, is that the exact, the ultimate understanding. I personally believe that the verses of the Quran have superpositions, that they can mean different, people can take different meanings from them by default. But you see, I'm just being transparent about it. So are the other sheikhs doing exactly what I'm doing, but they are just presenting it dogmatically. They're saying, no, I'm not saying this. This is the view, or this is the ruling Allah has said. I'm telling you, I'm just a kind of voice piece on behalf of God. The truth is, no, when you read something, you automatically apply an interpretation.
Exactly. And this has to be recognized. But I think the good thing is things are changing. People are starting to recognize that a scholarly view presented as a hujjah, as a proof, is not the case, or being considered like, oh, this is the definite interpretation because of the spread of knowledge. In the past, people listened more because there wasn't excessive knowledge. Today, it is accessible. If I don't agree with you, for example, I can find another view, right? But the main thing to recognize is to show humbleness and humility. And main thing is character, because a lot of times the reality is that if Islam spread in the past, it was through adab and character, which unfortunately a lot of times we're not showing that. Having said that, at the same time, one shouldn't take this exclusive interpretation and say, oh, I have the truth and no one has. If one believes in wahadat al-wujud, truth is found in everything, even those who are agnostic.
Absolutely. And there is, I believe there's an athar of, I think it's Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu an, but I'll have to double check it, but where it actually says this about, somebody says that hukm Allah is this, and he says, don't say hukm Allah.
Right.
Don't say it's the judgment
Yes,
of
he
God.
said
Yeah,
my
say that
view.
is
It is
my
something that, yes,
reading and understanding of what, and
right,
hence, and I get criticized. The reason I'm saying this is I read sometimes, like, people will come on my videos and put all these comments, and I get so, this is one of the criticism that they keep trying to smack at me, that, who the hell wants your view? But my point is that this is exactly how Imam Malik would answer. If you read the Mudawwana, if you read Imam Ahmad, his fatwa, Ahmad ibn Hanbal's fatwa, if you read that, they would say that, oh, the best of what is ahabbu ma sami'at, the best, the most beloved to what I've heard, or ara, I think, or they would say
right,
akra, I dislike that one
right,
should do this. They wouldn't say so
right,
often, this is Allah is saying this, they saying this. They would say
right,
that because this is their interpretation ultimately.
right. And another way of looking was that Sufyan al-Thawri said that if I would look at someone who's practicing another way that I don't know, I would assume the best and say, oh, he might know something that I don't know.
Yeah.
That is also important.
Yeah, there's such a beauty to that legacy. There is such a beauty to it.
And it's a shame that we are losing that legacy because we're having people who are not fully trained and they're speaking, like they say, above their pay grade, and they're coming on, they're coming on YouTube. They've just learned Islam in 2 years, and suddenly they wear that soap and they speak about Islam. And it's tragedy that thousands of people then listen to them because the reason is that they are presenting Islam in a way that is only one
Yeah.
interpretation. And that's not what Islam is about. Islam, whether we like it or not, is something that it's a Muslim discourse. It's a discourse among Muslims, and that is then reflected through this idea of what Islam is.
Oh, shukran jazilan, Sheikh Sayyid. It's
Right.
been an absolute pleasure.
Likewise.
Hayakallah.
And I just want to mention if anyone wants to be
Yeah.
connected, you're more than welcome to share
Is
my
that
Skype
what
ID with
the
them.
best, the Skype is the one? Right, okay. I just want to
Yeah.
make sure as well. Is that just that's just your name, isn't it? Sayyid Hammad
Syed
Ali.
Ali 2020 CA.
Whoa, okay. Just so guys, you heard that. It's all one word, isn't it?
Yes. Let me just type it to you if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken.
so Sayyid Hammad Ali. Hammad Ali. Right. 2020 CA at the end for Canada.
Yep.
I'll just put that
Yep.
in the comments there. People do connect.
Thank you.
Right, once again, Hayakallah wa barakallahu feek. May Allah bless you and your time, and shukran for sharing your thoughts and your evening with us. It's been an
You're welcome. Thank you for giving me the
absolute pleasure.
opportunity.
Damas y caballeros, ladies and gentlemen, the man, the myth, Dr. Syed Hammad Ali. Right, with that, people, have an awesome evening wherever you are. Do remember to subscribe. If you have not subscribed to my channels and click notifications, then by being part of that Wahdatul Wujud thing, I'm gonna have to somehow squeeze you out of that consciousness. People, stop being stingy. Show the love. That's it. Take care of yourselves wherever you are. Wassalamullahi alaikum wa rahmatuhu ta'ala wa barakatuh. I'm putting up the exit page, people. Stay blessed. Assalamu alaikum.